Hello, my friend. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm so glad you're here. If you've been enjoying these peaceful journeys through the past, leaving a like and subscribing is a wonderful way to support the channel. It helps more people discover these quiet corners of history. And before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Perhaps it's a quiet cabin in Montana, a little village in Lancashire, or a peaceful evening in the Blue Mountains of Australia. Leave me a comment if you'd like. I really do enjoy reading every single one. All right, my friend, are you comfortable? Good. Let us begin. Here is where I want to begin tonight, and it is not with a ballroom or a diamond necklace or any of the things you already picture when someone says the words Victorian high society. I want to begin with silence, specifically with this. In a truly wealthy Victorian household, silence itself was a manufactured luxury, engineered room by room at real expense, the same way you might pay extra today for triple glazed windows or a quiet neighbourhood. The house I want to take you into belongs to the Ashworth family of Ashcombe Hall in Cheshire in the autumn of 1874. Henry Ashworth built the family's fortune in cotton in the mills around Manchester, though by this point in his life he rarely visits one, having spent the last decade quietly transforming himself and his family into precisely the kind of landed, comfortable gentry his own father would have addressed with his hat in his hands. His wife, Charlotte, 38 years old, runs the house with the particular exacting competence of a woman who was raised in trade and married into land, and who understands, better than almost anyone around her, exactly how much every appearance of effortlessness actually costs. Their daughter Beatrice is 17, and this is her season, the year she's meant to be presented to society and with any luck to a suitable husband. Their son, Frederick, is 12, home for a few final weeks before he's sent away to school, trailing through the house with the restless energy of a boy who has not yet learned that Ashcombe Hall expects him to be quiet. And quiet in this house is not simply a mood, it is a system. There is a door on the ground floor covered on one side in thick green baize, the same felted wool used to muffle billiard tables, and its entire purpose is to separate the world the Ashworths live in from the world that keeps that world running. On the family side, the door is papered over to match the hallway, nearly invisible. On the servants' side, it's exactly what it looks like. A thick sound, deadening barrier between two households living inside one roof. Beyond it, footsteps, voices, the clatter of a dropped tray, all of it stays contained, the way you might close a door on a washing machine mid-cycle. On this side, in Charlotte's world, a house can seem to run itself. Meals appearing, fires already lit, a room tidied before anyone remembers untidying it. That is only the beginning of the engineering, though. The senior servants at Ashcombe Hall, the ones permitted upstairs where the family actually lives, wear shoes with soft felt soles, sometimes nothing more than thick wool socks pulled directly over their stockings, specifically so their movement through the house produces no sound at all. A housemaid crossing the drawing room to tend the fire should be, ideally, something you notice only because the room has grown slightly warmer, not because you heard her enter it. Coal is never simply poured into a scuttle within earshot of the family. It is measured out of hearing, carried in already portioned, so that the sound of coal striking metal, which is a genuinely unpleasant grating sound if you have ever actually heard it up close, never once reaches Charlotte's ears or Henry's, or the ears of whatever guest happens to be sitting in that room at the time. I find something almost strange to sit within that, honestly. An entire staff of people trained, at real cost, to become nearly invisible and nearly inaudible, so that a family could exist inside a version of comfort that felt, to them, like something close to magic. Rooms simply arranged themselves. Fires simply stayed lit. Nobody had to think about how. It is not only sound that money buys quiet control over, though. It is also things you would never think to consider a luxury at all. Things so small they barely register as objects, let alone as symbols of anything. Take toothbrushes. In most households across England in this decade, a toothbrush, if a family owned one at all, was likely shared, or at best handed down. Boiled occasionally in a half-hearted attempt at hygiene nobody fully understood the reasoning behind. At Ashcombe Hall, each member of the family has their own, made of bone and boar bristle, kept in a small monogrammed case in their own washstand drawer, replaced the moment the bristles begin to soften, rather than continued with out of necessity. Charlotte's linens, her undergarments, her nightgowns are each stitched with her initials in a thread so fine you would need to hold the fabric close to a lamp to notice it at all. Not because anyone else would ever see her nightgown, but because a woman of her position simply does not own things that could be mistaken for someone else's. Even the household's bed linens are numbered and logged in a book kept by the housekeeper, so that a torn sheet or a missing pillowcase can be traced to precisely which room, which week, which laundress handled it last. There is something almost tender in the excess of it, I think. An entire quiet infrastructure of ownership, built around objects nobody outside the family will ever lay eyes on. Now let me pull you somewhere else in the house for a moment, because there is a room at Ashcombe Hall that most visitors never see and almost never think about, tucked into the northern edge of the kitchen gardens, half sunk into the earth like a burial mound with a door in it. This is the ice house. Every winter, when the lake on the estate freezes thick enough, men from the estate cut great blocks of ice from its surface with long saws, hauling them by cart to this half-buried chamber, packing them in straw and sawdust so tightly that the ice, astonishingly, will still be there in August, slowly shrinking but never fully gone. This is how a household like the Ashworth can serve chilled desserts in the middle of a July heatwave, how they can have iced champagne at a dinner party in a decade before anyone in England has heard the word refrigeration. It is quite literally frozen winter, stored and rationed out across an entire year, at a cost in labour and land that almost nobody sitting at that dinner table would ever pause to calculate. Frederick at 12 still finds the icehouse faintly thrilling, sneaking down there on warm afternoons just to press his palm flat against a block of ice and feel it burn cold against his skin, which the under-gardener tolerates with the weary patience of a man who was once 12 himself and remembers exactly what that feeling was like. Upstairs, in Charlotte's own bedroom, there is a luxury so ordinary to her that she has stopped noticing it entirely, and it is this. Hot water arrives at her washstand without her ever seeing anyone carry it. A system of pipes, installed at considerable expense only 3 years ago, runs from a boiler in the basement up through the walls of the house, so that a housemaid somewhere below and out of sight need only open a valve for hot water to rise silently into a copper tank just outside Charlotte's dressing room. For most English women in 1874, hot water for washing still means a kettle, a fire, and considerable effort, carried can by can up narrow staircases by whichever servant drew that task for the morning. For Charlotte, it means turning a small brass handle and watching steam curl up out of a basin that, as far as her conscious mind is concerned, has simply produced heat out of nowhere. Her lady's maid, a quiet, capable woman named Agnes, who has been with the family for 6 years now, adds a few drops of rosewater to the basin before Charlotte even sits down, a habit so automatic between them that neither woman comments on it anymore. Charlotte's morning toilette is not rushed. It could not be rushed even if she wished it to be, given the layers involved, the careful lacing, the specific order in which each garment must go on beneath the next. But there is no urgency in the room either. This is simply how a morning unfolds when nobody in the house is waiting on you to hurry, when the entire structure of the day exists to accommodate whatever pace you naturally move at. I want to pause here and say something honestly. There is a particular kind of luxury that has nothing to do with objects at all, and everything to do with time, the sheer uncontested ownership of your own morning, unbroken by any obligation you did not choose yourself. Charlotte has that in abundance, and I think it is worth noticing separately from the rosewater and the piped hot water, because it is, in its way, the rarer thing. Downstairs in the breakfast room, Henry Ashworth reads 3 newspapers before 9 o'clock, ironed flat by a footman whose entire morning task, among several others, is running a warm iron over the daily papers before they reach the family, a practice that began, oddly enough, as a way of setting the ink so it would not smudge onto a gentleman's fingers or cuffs. Henry finds this small ritual faintly absurd, and has said so more than once, but has never once asked for it to stop, because it is one of those habits so embedded in a household's rhythm that questioning it would feel almost more disruptive than simply tolerating it. Frederick sits across from him, working through a boiled egg with the distracted intensity of a boy, whose mind is somewhere else entirely, likely still down at the ice house, or possibly on the pony he's not permitted to ride without a groom present. Henry watches his son over the top of his newspaper for a moment, and there is something in his face that softens slightly, a kind of fondness he rarely lets show fully, because he was raised by a father who considered any open affection toward a son a kind of weakness that would spoil him for the world. Henry has never fully decided whether he agrees with that philosophy, or simply inherited it without examining it closely, the way you inherit a coat that does not quite fit but that you wear anyway because it is what you were given. Henry mentions, without looking up from the paper, that Frederick will want his boots on by 10 since Watson is taking him down to the home farm. Frederick brightens instantly, asking whether it will be the whole morning, and Henry tells him it will be, provided he does not dawdle over that egg. It is such a small exchange, nothing anyone would think twice about, and yet I find something quietly moving in it. This careful, formal warmth passed between a father and son, who both, in their own separate ways, want more closeness than the rules of their world technically allow them. There is an object in Charlotte's jewellery case I want to tell you about, because it carries more history inside it than almost anything else she owns, and she rarely wears it. It is a fan, not an ordinary one, its guard sticks carved from tortoiseshell, its leaf painted by hand with a pastoral scene so fine you would need a magnifying glass to make out the individual figures in it. It was a wedding gift from Henry's mother, a woman who never fully approved of her son marrying a girl from a cotton fortune, rather than an old family with land already attached to its name, and the fan Charlotte has always suspected was less a gesture of welcome than a quiet, elegant reminder of exactly how far she still had to prove herself. She was right to suspect it. As it happens, though she's never confirmed this with anyone, least of all Henry, who remains cheerfully unaware that his mother's wedding gifts ever carried subtext of any kind. Charlotte keeps the fan anyway, in its own velvet-lined box, taken out perhaps twice a year for the largest occasions, and every time she opens its ribs there is a small, private satisfaction in knowing she has, in the years since, become rather more socially formidable than the woman who gave it to her ever managed to be. She has never said this thought aloud to a single living person. I am only telling you because it is late and you are half asleep, and some things are easier to say into the dark to someone who cannot repeat them. Social rules of a different, more visible kind govern nearly every hour of Charlotte's day, and one of the strangest to modern ears involves nothing more than small rectangles of card. Calling cards are not simply how you announce yourself at someone's door, though they are that too. They are an entire silent language of their own, folded corners meaning specific things, a corner turned down on the left signifying a visit paid in person, rather than sent by servant, cards left in careful, precise numbers depending on how many family members reside at the house being called upon. A lady who wishes to signal that a friendship has cooled, without ever saying a single unkind word, need only leave her card without asking to be received. A gesture that communicates with perfect social clarity exactly what it is meant to communicate while remaining, on its surface, entirely polite. Charlotte reads these cards the way you or I might read a text message, instantly, fluently, extracting meaning from details that would look, to an outsider, like nothing more than folded paper. And where there are calling cards, of course, there is gossip, because polite society, whatever else it claims to be, has always run on the careful, deniable exchange of other people's business. Charlotte's closest confidant in the neighbourhood is a woman named Louisa Fairfax, whose husband owns a considerably larger estate 2 valleys over, and whose friendship with Charlotte exists in that particular Victorian register of genuine warmth, layered over genuine competition, the 2 women exchanging news, recipes, and dressmaker recommendations in one breath, and quietly, precisely comparing the size of each other's conservatories in the next. There is a 3rd woman in their circle, a Mrs. Pemberton, newly arrived in the county with a fortune nobody can quite trace the origin of, and her arrival has become, over the last several weeks, a source of considerable and largely unspoken fascination. Nobody says anything unkind about her directly. That is not how it works. Instead, there are pauses, There are comments about how remarkably fine her new carriage is, delivered with a lift of the eyebrow that says considerably more than the words themselves. There is a shared, wordless understanding among Charlotte, Louisa, and several other women in their circle that Mrs. Pemberton will be watched carefully, patiently, until enough is known about her to decide, once and for all, exactly where she belongs. I find this particular kind of social surveillance oddly familiar, honestly, even now, at this distance. The specific tools have changed. The instinct underneath them, watching, comparing, quietly deciding who is in and who is still auditioning, has not changed nearly as much as we might like to think. That is where I want to leave the morning for now, though, because there is a great deal more of this house I still want to show you, and the day has really only just begun. Mid-morning at Ashcombe Hall belongs, more than any other hour, to Charlotte and her housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Crane, who has run the domestic side of this house for 11 years, with the quiet authority of someone who could, if she chose, run considerably larger operations than a single household. Together, in a small study off the main hallway, the two women go through the household accounts, and this is where the true, hidden cost of Charlotte's effortless mornings actually becomes visible, laid out in ink across the pages of a heavy ledger. The flowers alone, fresh cut and arranged in nearly every room of the house, replaced before they have any real chance to wilt, cost more in a single week than a farm labourer's family might see in an entire month. The candles, even now that gas lighting has reached most of the ground floor rooms, are still burned by the dozen in the drawing room and dining room each evening, because gaslight, however modern, carries a faint industrial smell that Charlotte finds unsuitable for entertaining, and candlelight, she believes, simply flatters a room and the people in it in a way gas never will. There is an entire line in the ledger devoted to ice, delivered weekly from a merchant in Manchester to supplement whatever the icehouse cannot provide, because even a well-managed icehouse eventually runs low, particularly in a warm year. And then there is the staff itself, which Mrs. Crane manages with the precision of a military campaign. 17 indoor servants currently work at Ashcombe Hall, from the butler down to the youngest scullery maid, each one paid according to a strict, almost invisible hierarchy that governs not only their wages, but where they are permitted to sit at the servants' table, which door they may use, and how they are to be addressed by everyone below and above them. A lady's maid like Agnes occupies a curious middle position in this world, neither quite a servant in the ordinary sense, since she dresses like the family and travels with them, nor quite a member of it either, existing in a kind of social suspension that Charlotte has never really thought carefully about, though Agnes, I suspect, thinks about it constantly. I want to sit with that thought for just a moment before we move on, because it is easy, telling a story like this one, to let the warmth of the house obscure how much its comfort was built, layer by layer, on other people's labour, most of whom left no letters, no diaries, nothing beyond a name in a wage book that has long since gone to dust in some solicitor's forgotten archive. Agnes herself keeps no diary that survives. We know she existed mostly because Charlotte mentions her, in passing, in letters that did survive, written to a sister in Liverpool, complaining once, almost fondly, that Agnes holds opinions about her bonnets she does not trouble to keep to herself. That is nearly the entire historical record of a woman who spent 6 years of her life inside the private rhythms of someone else's household. I find that worth pausing on. The house itself, beyond its staff, is its own kind of quiet extravagance. Ashcombe Hall was built only 20 years ago, commissioned by Henry's father in a style meant to look considerably older than it is, with a facade of stone quarried locally but cut to resemble the weathered, centuries-old manor houses that dot this part of Cheshire. There is something almost theatrical in that choice, a family with money only 2 generations old, building a house designed specifically to look as though it has always belonged to them. The gravel drive curves in a long, deliberate arc toward the entrance for no functional reason at all, simply because a straight drive looks apparently insufficiently grand. Even the trees along that drive were transplanted as mature specimens rather than saplings, at considerable expense, because Henry's father did not want to wait 30 years for his avenue to look established. He wanted it to look as though it always had been. There is a glass conservatory attached to the eastern side of the house, added 5 years ago, And it is here, more than anywhere else at Ashcombe Hall, that you can feel the specific texture of Victorian wealth most clearly. Because a conservatory serves almost no practical purpose whatsoever. It exists purely to prove that a family can afford to grow things that have no business growing in Cheshire at all. Orchids, orange trees, a small collection of ferns brought back from an uncle's posting in the West Indies, all of it kept alive through a coal-fired heating system running beneath the floor, consuming fuel around the clock through even the mildest months, simply so that Charlotte can walk through a warm, humid room full of tropical plants while Frost sits on the lawn just beyond the glass. Beatrice loves this room more than any other in the house, and spends a portion of nearly every afternoon here, curled into the wicker chair tucked behind the largest orange tree, reading novels she is not strictly supposed to be reading, the sort her mother would raise an eyebrow at, sensational things involving elopements and secrets and women who make choices considerably bolder than any Beatrice has ever been permitted to make herself. There is a particular kind of ache in being 17 and surrounded by so much, and yet feeling, most days, as though almost none of it is actually yours to choose. This is Beatrice's season, and the word itself, season, carries a weight in this household that Frederick, still years away from his own version of it, does not yet understand. It means that this year, for the first time, Beatrice will be presented properly, will attend the London events that matter, will be, in the plainest possible terms, put forward as available, evaluated by a network of mothers and hostesses and, eventually, by men she has mostly not yet met, all of whom will be assessing, quite openly, whether she represents a suitable match. Her fittings for the season's wardrobe have been underway for nearly a month now, with a dressmaker who travels up from London twice weekly specifically for the Ashworth family's custom, a woman named Mrs. Holloway, who has dressed 3 duchesses and speaks of them, when it suits her, with just enough casual familiarity to remind her other clients exactly what company they are keeping her in. Beatrice stands for these fittings, sometimes for well over an hour at a stretch, arms slightly raised, while pins are set and adjusted around her, the underlying corset already laced considerably tighter than what she wears for ordinary days, because a proper evening silhouette, the fashion insists, requires a waist measurement that Beatrice's actual, unmodified body does not naturally produce. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters. The corset itself, contrary to a great deal of what gets repeated about it today, was not, for most women who wore one, an instrument of active daily torment. It was closer to a familiar garment, worn from adolescence onward, that shaped the body gradually over years, rather than through any single dramatic cinching. But for a young woman being fitted specifically for the exaggerated silhouette of a formal season gown, laced tighter than her everyday stays, there is a real and specific discomfort involved, a shallowness to the breath, a certain careful stillness required simply to remain upright and composed through an entire evening. Beatrice has learned, this past month, to take smaller breaths, without anyone noticing. She has changed how she breathes at all. There is something Charlotte keeps in the bottom drawer of her writing desk that nobody else in this house has ever seen. Not Henry, not Agnes, not even Beatrice, who has spent enough idle hours poking through her mother's things over the years that Charlotte has had to become genuinely careful about where certain items live. It is a small plain prayer book, its cover worn soft at the corners, the kind of object that would look, to anyone who found it, almost embarrassingly humble sitting inside a house like this one. It belonged to her own mother, who kept a shop, a modest draper's shop in a modest northern town, and who never once in her entire life set foot inside anything resembling Ashcombe Hall. Charlotte reads from it sometimes, late at night, not for any particular religious comfort, though there is some of that too, but because holding it reminds her, briefly and privately, of exactly where she came from, a fact she has spent nearly 2 decades carefully, deliberately obscuring from almost everyone she now knows. Her vowels have been smoothed, her manner has been polished into something indistinguishable from women who were born into this life rather than married into it. And yet there remains, underneath all of it, a small persistent worry she has never spoken aloud to a single living soul, that someone, someday, at some dinner party or country house weekend, will look at her too closely and simply know, It is a strange kind of fear to carry inside a house this large, this secure, this apparently untouchable, but I think most of us carry some version of it, don't we? Some quiet worry that the life we have built could, under the wrong scrutiny, come apart at a seam we thought we had sewn shut years ago. Charlotte closes the drawer most nights within a minute or two of opening it. It is enough, apparently, simply to know the book is there. Let me tell you about Charlotte's jewellery, because there is more strategy in it than you might expect from a collection of pretty objects sitting in velvet trays. Wealthy Victorian women did not simply wear whatever caught their eye. Jewellery, worn correctly, functioned almost like a second silent form of correspondence, communicating occasion, rank, and mood to anyone in the room who knew how to read it, which, among Charlotte's circle, was everyone. Diamonds, real substantial diamonds rather than the smaller decorative pieces suitable for daytime, were reserved almost exclusively for evening, and specifically for evenings of a certain formality, because diamonds, catching candlelight the way they do, were considered far too dazzling, too aggressive, for daylight or for any occasion before dark. A woman who wore heavy diamonds to an afternoon luncheon would not be admired for it. She would be quietly, permanently judged, marked as someone who either did not know the rules or, worse, knew them and chose to ignore them, which was somehow considered the greater sin. Pearls, by contrast, were acceptable at nearly any hour, prized specifically for their softness, their refusal to compete with daylight the way a diamond does. There is a particular piece in Charlotte's collection, a garnet and gold bracelet, that she wears more than almost anything else she owns. Not because it is her most valuable piece, it is not by a considerable margin, but because Henry gave it to her early in their marriage, before either of them had fully settled into the roles they would go on to occupy for the rest of their lives together. She remembers the evening he gave it to her with unusual clarity, the way you remember very few evenings from that many years back, and there is something she has never told him, which is that she still, even now, occasionally opens the drawer just to look at it, without any particular occasion requiring her to wear it at all. Beauty itself, beyond jewellery, operated as its own careful performance of wealth. Charlotte's complexion is maintained through a regimen involving milk baths twice weekly, prepared by Agnes with fresh milk, warmed to precisely the right temperature, along with a paste of ground almonds used to gently exfoliate skin that in Charlotte's world is never meant to show any visible sign of labour, weather, or age. Her hands in particular receive careful, ongoing attention, soaked nightly in a mixture of glycerin and rosewater, because hands, more than almost any other part of a lady's body, were red as evidence, soft uncalloused hands proving, at a glance, a life free from manual work of any kind. There is a quiet cruelty tucked into that particular standard, if you look at it closely enough, the way an entire beauty ideal was constructed almost entirely around the visible absence of labour, meaning that every woman working to maintain it was, in effect, performing a kind of labour herself, simply one designed to be invisible. By early afternoon, the household's rhythm shifts again, and this is when Charlotte typically receives callers or pays calls herself in a strict and largely unspoken window of time that everyone in her circle understands without ever needing it explained to them. Calls are made between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, never earlier, never later, a narrow, universally agreed upon window that governs the movement of nearly every carriage among the wealthy families of the county on any given weekday. Today Louisa Fairfax arrives just after 3, and the two women settle into the smaller of Ashcombe Hall's 2 drawing rooms, the one reserved for informal visits among close friends rather than the grander room used for larger gatherings. Tea arrives, along with a plate of small, precisely cut sandwiches, and the conversation moves, as it nearly always does between them, through several layers at once, genuine affection running just beneath a current of careful mutual assessment. Louisa asks, in the particular tone of a woman who already knows a good deal more than she is letting on, whether Beatrice's fitting went well. Charlotte answers that it went well enough, and mentions that Mrs. Holloway favours the blue silk over the ivory for suiting her daughter better, though she confesses she had rather set her own heart on the ivory. Louisa offers, mildly, that the ivory is the safer choice, while the blue says considerably more. There is a brief pause here, and I want you to notice it, because a pause like this one is doing real work. What Louisa is actually asking beneath the fabric talk is whether Beatrice is being positioned this season as a young woman who intends to be noticed, or one who intends to be merely safely presentable. Charlotte understands the question perfectly. She simply chooses, for now, not to answer it directly, offering instead that they shall see how the season unfolds, which is itself an answer of a kind, and Louisa, reading it correctly, moves the conversation smoothly onward to the topic of Mrs. Pemberton's recently unveiled carriage, a subject both women find considerably easier to discuss without any careful management required at all. Mrs. Pemberton, as it happens, has become something of a running subject across nearly every drawing room in the county this autumn, and the fascination surrounding her says a great deal about how tightly controlled entry into this particular world actually was, regardless of how much money a family happened to possess. Her husband made his fortune, it is generally understood, somewhere in shipping, though nobody has managed to pin down precisely where or how, and the couple arrived in Cheshire only this past spring, purchasing a substantial house 2 miles from Ashcombe Hall, with what appeared to be very little effort or negotiation at all. Money alone in this world has never been sufficient. Charlotte herself understands this better than most, having married into land rather than been born to it, and she recognizes, with something close to genuine sympathy tucked inside her curiosity, exactly the position Mrs. Pemberton now occupies, wealthy enough to build the right kind of house, entertain in the right kind of style, and yet still, for now, standing just outside the invisible boundary that separates money from belonging. That boundary is maintained through 100 small mechanisms, who calls on whom first, whose invitations are accepted without hesitation, and whose are quietly, politely deferred, whose daughter is included in the smaller, more intimate gatherings where the real business of matchmaking and alliance actually happens. Louisa has not called on Mrs. Pemberton yet. Neither has Charlotte. Both women are aware that this delay is itself a form of communication, a way of establishing, without a single unkind word ever being spoken, that acceptance into this circle is not automatic, that it must be earned, watched for, granted gradually rather than assumed. Charlotte suspects she will call within the month. She is, after all, not an unkind woman, and there is something in Mrs. Pemberton's situation that reminds her a little too closely of her own early years in this world for her to enjoy prolonging the wait much further, but not yet, not today. Frederick returns from the home farm just after 4, mud on his boots and a scrape on one knuckle he is inordinately proud of, launching into a detailed account of a calf born that morning that nobody particularly asked for but that Charlotte listens to anyway, with the specific patient attention of a mother who understands that being asked to listen and being genuinely listened to are 2 entirely different gifts, and that her son, at 12, can still tell the difference perfectly well. Tea itself, taken again more formally around 5, carries its own quiet history of luxury that most people sipping a cup today never think twice about. Tea was, within living memory of Charlotte's own grandmother, an expensive imported good, kept under lock in a small wooden caddy, with the mistress of the house personally controlling access to it, doling out leaves by the spoonful because the cost of tea, sugar, and the porcelain used to serve them all represented, not so very long ago, genuine wealth on display rather than the everyday habit it has since become for nearly everyone in England. By 1874, tea has grown considerably more affordable, though the Ashworth's particular blend, sourced through a merchant who deals directly with plantations in Assam and Ceylon, still costs considerably more than what a labouring family in Manchester could ever justify purchasing. The sugar accompanying it arrives in tall, solid cones, wrapped in blue paper, requiring a servant to break pieces off with a special pair of sugar nips before it ever reaches the table in the small, delicate lumps Charlotte's guests expect. Even the porcelain itself, painted with a pattern imported from a manufacturer in Worcester, was chosen specifically because its delicacy, its near translucence when held to the light, signals a household that can afford objects that would shatter under any real daily use, objects that exist purely to be beautiful and are handled, therefore, with corresponding care. There is a particular kind of luxury, I think, in owning things specifically because they are fragile, because their fragility itself becomes evidence that your life contains enough stability, enough careful handling, enough servants trained to carry a tea tray without a single misstep, that something so delicate can survive within it year after year without ever once being broken. The cake served alongside this tea, made fresh that morning by the household's cook, a formidable woman named Mrs. Abbott, who has run Ashcombe Hall's kitchens for nearly as long as Mrs. Crane has managed the rest of the house, involve ingredients that would have been unthinkable luxuries only a generation or two earlier. Vanilla brought from Madagascar, candied orange peel, a particular kind of fine white flour bleached and sifted so many times that it produces a crumb almost unbearably light, nothing like the coarser, heavier bread most of England still eats at every meal. Mrs. Abbott takes genuine pride in this lightness. She has been known to remake an entire batch of sponge if it does not rise, in her estimation, quite high enough, an act of perfectionism that costs the household real money in wasted ingredients, but that nobody upstairs has ever once questioned or even, as far as she knows, noticed. As the afternoon light begins to soften outside the drawing-room windows, I want to take you somewhere else in this world entirely for a while, because Ashcombe Hall is not the only house that matters to this family, and there is a whole other layer of Victorian high society luxury bound up in a place the Ashworths only occupy for a few months each year. Every spring, as the London season approaches, the family relocates almost entirely to a townhouse in Belgravia, a narrower, taller sort of grandeur than the sprawling comfort of Cheshire, rented for the season at a cost that would astonish most of the people who will attend the parties held inside it. This season itself is really a kind of elaborate extended job interview, dressed up as a series of parties, dinners and balls, running roughly from April through July, its entire structure built around a single underlying purpose, matching eligible young women of good family to eligible young men under the careful, watchful management of their mothers. Beatrice's presentation at court forms the formal opening of this process, a ritual so specific in its requirements that entire industries in London exist purely to service it. She will wear on that day 3 white ostrich feathers fixed upright in her hair, a veil of white tulle, and a train measured to an exact regulation length, all of it governed by rules so precise that dressmakers who specialize in court presentation gowns keep printed guides simply to avoid the embarrassment of a client being turned away at the palace door for a train an inch too short. Beatrice's presentation itself, when it finally happens this coming spring, will last perhaps 90 seconds, Beatrice walking forward, curtsying to the Queen, or, more likely given the Queen's increasing reluctance to preside over such things herself, to whichever senior royal has been delegated the task that particular afternoon, before being ushered onward to make way for the next young woman in an endless, glittering queue of nearly identical hopeful curtsies. 90 seconds and months of preparation, and a gown that will likely never be worn again in quite that configuration once its purpose has been served. I find something almost poignant in that ratio, the sheer disproportion between the effort poured into a single fleeting moment and the moment itself, over almost as soon as it begins. Charlotte remembers her own presentation 17 years ago now, with a clarity that surprises her whenever she lets herself think about it. She remembers less about the Queen, or the room, or even her own gown, than she does about the specific ache in her legs from standing so long in the anteroom beforehand, and the strange sudden calm that settled over her the moment she actually stepped forward, as though her body understood, even if her mind did not quite catch up until later, that the hardest part had simply been the waiting. Back in Cheshire, evening at Ashcombe Hall arrives with its own quiet transformation, because dinner, even on an ordinary night with no guests at all, requires the entire household to change clothes in a way that would strike most of us today as extraordinary for a meal shared only among family. Charlotte retires to her dressing room around 6 to change from her afternoon gown into something appropriate for the evening, a ritual so fixed in this world that a lady who came down to dinner still wearing her daytime dress would cause genuine, if silent, concern among the staff, who would wonder, quietly, whether something had gone wrong upstairs. Agnes helps her into a gown of deep plum silk, nothing so elaborate as what she would wear for an actual dinner party, but formal enough, structured enough, that the simple act of changing into it marks the day's transition from activity into something slower, more ceremonial. Henry changes as well, into evening dress that differs only slightly from what he wore that morning to anyone untrained in these distinctions, though the differences, to Charlotte's eye, are entirely obvious and entirely necessary. Tonight there are no guests, only the family, and yet dinner is still served across 3 courses by 2 footmen under Mr. Sutcliffe's watchful direction, the same china used whether 4 people or 14 are seated at the table, because standards in this house do not flex according to audience. There is a particular kind of luxury in that consistency. I think elegance here is not a performance reserved for company, but simply the ordinary texture of daily life, expensive and unhurried whether anyone outside the family is there to witness it or not. Conversation across dinner moves easily between them, Frederick recounting the calf again with a few new embellished details, Beatrice asking her father a question about the mills he still technically owns, though he visits them so rarely now that his answers carry a certain vagueness he tries, not entirely successfully, to disguise. Henry built this family's fortune with his own hands, in a sense, or at least oversaw its building closely enough in his younger years to have genuinely understood the machinery, the workers, the raw mechanics of cotton turning into cloth, turning into money. His children, growing up entirely on the other side of that transformation, understand almost none of it, and Henry has never quite decided whether that gap troubles him or simply represents, in its own way, exactly the outcome he worked so hard to achieve. A fortnight later, Ashcombe Hall hosts its first real dinner party of the autumn, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because there is a whole architecture of hidden luxury built into an evening like this one, most of it invisible to the 18 guests who will sit down at Charlotte's table tonight without ever once thinking about the machinery required to get them there. The invitations went out 3 weeks ago, engraved rather than simply printed, on cardstock thick enough that you could feel the raised lettering under your thumb if you ran a finger across it, a small tactile detail that communicated, before a single guest had even read the words, exactly what kind of evening they were being invited to. Mrs. Crane spent the better part of 2 days working out the seating arrangement, a task considerably more complicated than it sounds, because precedence in this world is not casual. A gentleman is seated according to his rank, his title if he has one, his standing relative to every other gentleman present, and getting it wrong, seating someone below their due position, is not a small social slip. It is the kind of mistake a hostess is remembered for, sometimes for years. Charlotte herself will not sit beside Henry tonight. That is not how it works. She will be led into dinner by whichever gentleman ranks highest among the guests, and will spend the meal seated beside him, making careful, attentive conversation, while Henry does the same with whichever lady holds the corresponding position of honour among the women present. It is a system designed in theory to ensure lively conversation rather than married couples simply talking to each other all evening as they might at home, though Charlotte has occasionally wondered, privately, whether the real function of it is simply to remind everyone present, continuously, exactly where they stand relative to everyone else in the room. Dinner itself will run to 9 courses tonight, not because anyone present intends to eat 9 full portions, but because the sheer number of courses is itself a demonstration, each small plate a fresh opportunity to display another wine, another preparation, another piece of the family's silver. There is a soup course, followed by fish, followed by a small savoury course meant purely to cleanse the palate, followed by the first of 2 meat courses, an entremets of vegetables prepared almost as elaborately as the meat itself, a second meat course, a sweet course, cheese, and finally dessert, each one arriving on its own particular china, cleared by footmen moving with a choreography so practiced it looks, to anyone watching, like something closer to dance than labour. The wine alone tells its own story about what this family can afford and, just as importantly, what they know. A different wine accompanies nearly every course, chosen not simply for taste, but for the specific, almost coded message each choice sends to guests, sophisticated enough to read it. A sherry with the soup, a crisp white with the fish, champagne, chilled in ice carried up specially from that half-buried house in the kitchen garden, arrives partway through the meal and continues, refreshed, through several of the courses that follow. Henry's cellar holds bottles that have been aging since before Beatrice was born, some of them purchased specifically as an investment as much as a pleasure, wine being one of the few luxuries in this world that genuinely improves the longer it sits untouched, gathering value in the dark, the way almost nothing else in a household does. Each guest at the table has, laid out before them, a full service of silver cutlery specific to each course, so many pieces that a young woman new to this world could easily find herself uncertain which fork belongs to which plate, a mistake that would be noticed quietly by everyone at the table, and forgiven, but noticed all the same. Charlotte taught Beatrice this particular knowledge the way you might teach a second language, gradually, through repetition, over years of family meals where the correct utensil simply became, eventually, a kind of instinct rather than a rule she had to consciously remember. Conversation moves, as it always does at a table like this one, through a careful, well-practiced rotation of acceptable topics, politics discussed in general terms rather than anything too pointed, the weather, the state of the roads, a recent engagement, a forthcoming wedding, gentle, circling talk that reveals, if you listen closely enough, a great deal about who is rising and who is falling within this particular social world, without a single participant ever appearing to gossip outright. There is an art to it, saying everything while appearing to say almost nothing at all, and Charlotte, after nearly 2 decades of practice, has become genuinely skilled at it. When the meal finally concludes, the ladies rise together, at Charlotte's signal, and withdraw to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen behind at the table with the port, the cigars, and whatever conversation men in this era considered unsuitable for mixed company, a separation so standard that nobody in the room thinks to question it, though I confess I have always found something faintly comic in imagining what exactly these men believed themselves free to discuss only once the women had safely left the room. In the drawing room, the women settle into a slower rhythm entirely, tea and small conversation replacing the more performative talk of dinner, and this is where Charlotte notices, with the same quiet, watchful attention she brings to everything, that Mrs. Pemberton has been seated tonight, invited at last, her call having finally been paid and returned over the past fortnight in the slow, deliberate manner these things require. Mrs. Pemberton sits slightly apart from the main cluster of conversation, not excluded exactly, but not yet fully woven in either, and Charlotte finds herself, almost without deciding to, crossing the room to sit beside her. Charlotte tells her, simply, that her gown is lovely, that shade of green being a difficult one to wear well, and that she manages it. It is a small thing, barely a sentence, and yet it lands exactly as intended, a genuine compliment offered without condescension, the kind of gesture that, among women fluent in this particular social language, functions as a small, deliberate act of welcome. Mrs. Pemberton's shoulders ease, just slightly, and the conversation that follows between them runs easier than either woman perhaps expected. Charlotte remembers, watching her, exactly what this specific kind of evening felt like from the outside looking in, and there is a version of herself, 17 years younger, standing just behind her own eyes as she says it. When the gentlemen rejoin them roughly 40 minutes later, smelling faintly of cigar smoke that no amount of careful ventilation ever fully disguises, the evening shifts once more, this time toward music. Beatrice is asked to play, as she nearly always is at these gatherings, and she moves to the piano with the particular, practiced composure of a young woman who has performed this exact small ritual dozens of times before, choosing a piece she knows well enough that her hands could manage it, even if her mind wandered entirely elsewhere, which, tonight, it rather does. She plays competently, gracefully, the room settling into that particular warm hush that follows a young woman performing something she has clearly worked hard to make look effortless, and when she finishes, the applause is warm and genuine, and Beatrice returns to her seat with colour in her cheeks that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Charlotte watches her daughter settle back beside Louisa's own daughter, the two girls immediately bending their heads together in the particular private way of young women exchanging something they clearly do not intend the rest of the room to hear. And there is a small, unguarded smile that crosses Charlotte's face for just a moment before she remembers herself and returns her attention to the conversation beside her. The last carriage pulls away from Ashcombe Hall a little after midnight, and the house exhales into that particular quiet that follows any large gathering, servants moving through the rooms below stairs, clearing what remains, while upstairs Charlotte and Henry find themselves, for the first time all evening, genuinely alone together. Henry pours himself a small measure of brandy in his study, and Charlotte, still in her plum silk from earlier though she has long since kicked off her shoes beneath her skirts, settles into the chair opposite him rather than heading straight up to bed. Henry observes that Mrs. Pemberton seemed easier tonight. Charlotte tucks her feet up beneath her, a posture she would never allow herself in front of anyone but Henry, and answers that the woman was never truly difficult, only new, and that it takes a season or two before anyone stops watching you quite so closely. Henry looks at her for a moment over the rim of his glass, something quietly knowing in his expression, and murmurs that she would know. She agrees simply, without any particular weight in it, though there is a great deal folded inside those two small words that neither of them chooses to unpack any further tonight. It is one of the small mercies of a long marriage, I think, this ability to acknowledge something true and difficult, and simply let it sit there between you, unexamined, because examining it further would serve no real purpose beyond reopening something that has by now mostly healed. They sit together a while longer, talking of nothing especially important, the evening's success, a guest's unexpected engagement announcement, whether Frederick ought to be allowed a dog of his own before he leaves for school, and there is a comfort in this late, quiet stretch of the night that I think matters more to both of them than almost anything that happened at dinner. The house around them has gone properly silent now, the felt-souled servants long since retired to their own quarters on the top floor, the green baize door closed on both sides of the world it separates. Let me take you into a different room of this house now, one I have not shown you yet, tucked at the end of the eastern corridor on the ground floor. This is Henry's library, and it is in its own quiet way one of the more revealing rooms in the entire house, because a library, in this world, was never simply a place to keep books. It was a declaration. There are close to 3,000 volumes here, bound in leather, arranged by a system only Henry and the household's part-time librarian, a retired schoolmaster who visits twice a month to catalogue new acquisitions, fully understand. A great many of these books have never been opened. That is not a criticism, exactly, or at least not one Henry would recognise as fair, because the library's purpose was never purely about reading. A gentleman's library, filled with the complete works of writers whose names he could recite without necessarily having read a page of them, signalled education, taste, and a particular kind of settled permanence, the sense of a family that has always valued learning, whether or not any individual member of that family happened to spend their evenings actually engaged in it. Henry does read, as it happens, more than most of his peers, drawn particularly to agricultural treatises and, somewhat to his own private embarrassment, sensational adventure novels he keeps on a lower shelf where a casual visitor is unlikely to notice them. Frederick has already begun sneaking in here in the evenings before bed, working his way slowly through a set of illustrated volumes about explorers and expeditions, and Henry has noticed this habit and said nothing about it directly, simply making sure, without any obvious effort, that new volumes on similar subjects continue quietly appearing on the lower shelves where his son is most likely to find them. There is a portrait above the fireplace in this room, of Henry's father, the man who built this house and stocked this very library with its first several hundred volumes, painted in the year before his death by an artist of modest but respectable reputation, the kind hired by families who could not quite justify the fees commanded by the truly fashionable portraitists of London, but who still wanted something considerably better than an amateur's effort. Henry looks up at this portrait sometimes without entirely meaning to, mid-conversation, mid-thought, and there is a whole complicated inheritance folded into that upward glance, admiration and obligation, and a faint, persistent worry that he has not quite lived up to whatever his father intended this house, this library, this entire careful construction of gentility to eventually become. There is another luxury hidden inside this house that most visitors walk straight past without ever noticing it for what it is, and that is the glass house attached to the kitchen gardens, a considerably more utilitarian structure than the ornamental conservatory Beatrice favours, but in some ways an even more extraordinary display of wealth. Inside it, trained against a heated back wall, grows a small collection of pineapple plants, tended year-round by a gardener whose entire specialized skill lies in coaxing a tropical fruit to survive, let alone fruit, in the cold, wet climate of Cheshire. A single pineapple, grown this way, represents months of careful heating, feeding, and patience. And for much of the century just before this one, a fresh pineapple was considered so extravagant a luxury that wealthy households without the resources to grow their own would sometimes rent one for the evening, purely for display on a dinner table, an object meant to be admired rather than eaten, returned the following morning to whichever fruiterer had supplied it, its flesh never once touched by a knife. Henry finds this particular piece of family lore, passed down from his father's generation, faintly ridiculous, and delights in telling it to dinner guests, specifically because of how thoroughly it baffles anyone hearing it for the first time. By the time the Ashworths eat their own pineapples, grown in this glass house rather than rented for show, the practice has softened somewhat, though the fruit itself remains rare enough that its appearance at a dessert course still draws a small, appreciative murmur from guests who understand exactly what they are looking at. There is something almost absurd, viewed from enough distance, in the sheer effort required to produce a single piece of fruit that grows elsewhere in the world, in careless abundance under nothing more than ordinary sunlight. But absurdity has never really been the point of luxury, has it? The point is precisely the effort, the impracticality, how something so difficult to produce becomes, by virtue of that difficulty alone, worth producing at all. Out past the kitchen gardens, beyond the ice house and the glass house, sits the stable block, and it is here that some of the family's most visible wealth actually lives, because in 1874 the quality of a family's horses and carriages functions as a kind of rolling, moving advertisement seen by anyone who happens to be standing along the road when the Ashworths pass. Henry keeps 6 carriage horses, matched in pairs by colour and height, with an exactness that took the head coachman, a man named Dobbs who has worked with horses his entire adult life, the better part of 2 years to assemble properly. There is a landau for formal occasions, its body lacquered so many times that it holds a depth to its shine that catches the light in a particular way, and a smaller, lighter brougham for everyday errands, along with a pony trap that technically belongs to Frederick, though he is permitted to drive it himself only on the estate's own grounds, and only under close supervision. The coach house itself is kept as scrupulously clean as any room inside the main hall. Harnesses oiled and polished, the family crest, adopted only in the last generation but treated with all the reverence of something centuries old, painted fresh onto each carriage door every spring. Dobbs and the stable staff live in rooms above the coach house, a small separate world of their own, distinct even from the servants' quarters inside the main house, and there is a particular hierarchy among outdoor staff that mirrors in its own way the careful gradations governing everyone inside. A coachman ranks above a groom ranks above a stable boy. Each position carries its own uniform, its own wages, its own small, precise territory of responsibility that nobody on either side of that hierarchy would ever think to blur. When Charlotte travels anywhere of consequence, the horses drawing her carriage are groomed to a standard that would take most working families' entire weekly income to replicate. Coats brushed until they gleam, manes plaited with small ribbons matching whatever occasion she is dressed for, hooves polished with a blacking that serves no purpose beyond appearance. A horse's comfort and a horse's beauty, in this world, are treated as 2 entirely separate categories of concern, and considerable money gets spent maintaining both. I want to bring you back inside now, into Charlotte's dressing room, because there is a particular luxury tucked into this space that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets, and it is simply the sheer volume of clothing itself. Charlotte's wardrobe, a series of tall mahogany presses lining nearly one entire wall, holds close to 60 gowns at any given moment across the various seasons and occasions of her year. Day dresses and walking dresses and dinner gowns and ball gowns and morning wear kept ready though rarely needed, each one requiring its own particular undergarments, its own specific jewellery, its own careful sequence of putting on that Agnes has memorised as precisely as she has memorised anything in her life. Most women in England, even comfortably middle-class women, owned perhaps a handful of dresses total, mended and retrimmed and turned inside out to extend their wear across years rather than seasons. Charlotte's dresses are, by contrast, rarely worn more than a dozen or so times before being set aside, not from any actual wear or damage, but because fashion itself moves quickly enough among her circle that a gown 2 seasons old, however well made, begins to mark its wearer as somehow behind, somehow not quite attending closely enough to what matters. There is a whole quiet economy built around what happens to these barely worn gowns once Charlotte sets them aside. Some are given to Agnes, who either wears them herself, altered to fit, or sells them on to a second-hand dealer in Manchester who specialises in exactly this trade, gently used luxury clothing trickling downward through several more owners before it finally, eventually, wears through completely, decades after it first left a dressmaker's workshop in London. Agnes has, over her 6 years with the family, built up a wardrobe of her own considerably finer than anything she could ever have afforded new, entirely through this slow, steady downward flow of Charlotte's discarded fashion. I find something worth noticing in that particular chain, the way luxury, even when it is eventually let go of, rarely simply disappears. It moves, it changes hands, changes owners, slides quietly down through layers of society that would never otherwise have touched something so fine, carrying with it, in its stitching and its cut, a kind of ghost of the life it was originally made for. Frederick's education, until he leaves for school in a few weeks, happens in a schoolroom on the 2nd floor of the house, under the instruction of a tutor named Mr. Aldous, a young man only recently down from Cambridge, who lives with the family in a peculiar social position, not entirely unlike Agnes's own, too educated and too well-spoken to belong among the servants exactly, yet not quite a member of the family either, taking his meals sometimes with the family, and sometimes, depending on the occasion, separately. The schoolroom itself holds an odd, careful blend of luxury and austerity that I think tells you something real about how this family thinks about education. The furniture is plain, functional, nothing like the elegant pieces filling the rest of the house, because a child's mind in this world is meant to be disciplined rather than indulged. And yet the materials Frederick learns from represent, in their own way, a considerable expense, globes and atlases, and a small telescope purchased specifically so he might learn the basic principles of astronomy firsthand, rather than only from a textbook, along with a set of specimen boxes containing pressed plants and mounted insects, assembled by a previous tutor and added to steadily ever since. Beatrice was educated in this same room years earlier, though her curriculum ran along a rather different path, considerably heavier on French, on music, on the kind of accomplished but deliberately limited learning considered appropriate for a young woman whose ultimate purpose, in the eyes of this world, was never meant to include a profession or any real intellectual independence at all. She resented this, quietly, for a period during her early teens, watching Frederick's lessons grow steadily more serious, more substantial, while her own remained fixed at a certain careful, decorative level, no matter how clearly she outpaced him in nearly every subject they briefly shared. She has mostly made her peace with it by now, or has at least learned to keep whatever resentment remains carefully out of sight, the way she has learned to keep so much else carefully out of sight this particular season. There is a novel tucked beneath her mattress at this very moment, borrowed from a friend and containing, among its various scandalous plot developments, a young woman who simply refuses the marriage her family has arranged for her and goes on, astonishingly, to build a contented life entirely on her own terms. Beatrice has read the ending 3 times already. She has not decided yet what she thinks about it, only that she cannot seem to stop turning back to it. Charity, too, occupies a strange and specific place in a woman like Charlotte's life, expected of her in a way that has almost nothing to do with generosity as we might understand it today, and almost everything to do with obligation, visibility, and the maintenance of a very particular kind of social order. Twice a month, Charlotte visits several cottages in the village nearest the estate, bringing baskets prepared by Mrs. Abbott's kitchen, broth, bread, sometimes a length of flannel for a family with a new baby, distributed with a warmth that is, in Charlotte's case, entirely genuine, though the entire ritual exists within a framework she has never fully examined, and probably never will. These visits are not simply kindness, they are also, whether Charlotte consciously thinks of them this way or not, a demonstration, to the village and to her own social circle alike, that the Ashworths take their responsibilities as the great house of the parish seriously, that wealth here comes bundled with a certain paternal obligation toward those who work the land and mills that fund it. The families Charlotte visits understand this dynamic too, in their own way, receiving her baskets with genuine gratitude tangled together with a wariness that never fully dissolves, aware that this particular kindness flows in only one direction, from the house down to the cottage, never the reverse. There is a woman in one of these cottages, a widow named Sarah Tench, whose husband worked for years in Henry's mills before his death, who Charlotte has come to know rather better than most of the others on her rounds, the two women talking sometimes for a full quarter hour on the cottage doorstep, about nothing in particular, weather, children, the small daily texture of their entirely different lives. Charlotte finds herself, on these visits, speaking to Sarah with a directness she rarely allows herself among her own circle, something in the absence of any real social competition between them that lets both women simply talk, plainly, the way you might with someone you have known a very long time, even though, in truth, they have known each other only a handful of years, and meet only ever on this single narrow occasion each fortnight. There is a writing desk in the corner of Charlotte's private sitting room, and I want to tell you about it, because correspondence in this world is its own quiet theatre of wealth and precision. The paper itself is watermarked, thick enough that a single sheet feels substantial between the fingers, and every piece bears, embossed at the top, the address of the house itself, Ashcombe Hall, printed in a script so delicate it seems almost reluctant to announce itself too loudly. Charlotte writes perhaps a dozen letters a week, to her sister in Liverpool, to Louisa when they are apart, to a wider circle of acquaintances scattered across the country whose friendships are maintained almost entirely through this steady, unhurried exchange of folded paper. There are strict, unspoken rules governing even this. A letter to a close friend might run to 4 full pages, filled with genuine news and genuine feeling. A letter to a more distant acquaintance, someone recently met at a dinner party whose friendship is still being cautiously tested, would never run so long, 3 or 4 careful paragraphs at most, warm but measured, revealing exactly as much of yourself as the relationship has, so far, earned. The ink itself comes from a specific supplier in London, a rich dark blue-black that Charlotte prefers over the more common plain black most households use, a small personal signature so subtle that only another woman equally attentive to such details would ever notice it at all, her seal, pressed into wax at the close of any letter she considers formal enough to warrant it, bears the family's crest, and there is something Charlotte still finds faintly thrilling, even after all these years, in that small ceremonial moment, wax melting, seal pressing down, an ordinary letter transformed briefly into something that feels almost official. Replies arrive by the household's own post, collected daily from the village and sorted by Mr. Sutcliffe before being brought up on a silver tray, and there is a particular kind of anticipation in this daily ritual that Charlotte has never fully outgrown, the small flare of curiosity every household member feels, however briefly, at the sight of an unfamiliar hand on an envelope addressed to them. On a warmer afternoon later that same week, Ashcombe Hall hosts a garden party, a considerably more relaxed occasion than the formal dinner had been, though relaxed in this world is always a relative term. Croquet has been set up on the great lawn, hoops arranged with careful precision by the head gardener, who takes a surprising quiet pride in the exactness of his lines, and small tables scattered across the grass hold pitchers of lemonade and, for those who prefer it, something rather stronger, discreetly available to any gentleman who knows to ask for it. Beatrice plays croquet with an easy competitiveness that surprises some of the young men present, who perhaps expected, given her quiet manner at dinner, a rather more decorative approach to the game. She is not decorative about it in the slightest. She lines up her shots with genuine focus, groans audibly when a ball goes wide, and there is a moment, watching her laugh at her own poor aim, when Charlotte, seated in the shade with several other mothers, feels a small, sharp pang of something that is not quite worry and not quite pride, but sits somewhere close to both, the recognition that her daughter is, underneath all the careful training of the last several months, still very much herself. A young man named Arthur Wexford, second son of a family Charlotte knows slightly from London, partners Beatrice for several rounds, and there is nothing especially remarkable about the pairing on its surface, simply two young people enjoying an afternoon game, and yet every mother on that lawn, Charlotte included, watches the interaction with considerably more attention than the casual scene would seem to warrant. This is, after all, precisely the kind of small, apparently unplanned encounter that the entire architecture of the season exists to produce, carefully engineered informality, opportunities for young people to actually speak to each other beneath the watchful, deniable supervision of everyone around them. Beatrice, for her part, seems entirely unaware of being watched quite so closely, laughing at something Arthur says, missing an easy shot as a direct result, and there is a lightness in her this afternoon that Charlotte has not seen quite so unguarded in weeks, not since the fittings began, not since the season's particular weight settled properly onto her daughter's shoulders. I think there is something worth holding on to in that lightness, however brief it turns out to be. A girl, still mostly a girl despite everything being asked of her this year, simply enjoying a game on a warm afternoon before the rest of it fully begins. Later that same month, a photographer arrives from Manchester, engaged for the day to make a formal portrait of the family, and this too carries its own particular weight of expense and effort that would surprise anyone who has only ever known photography as something instant and effortless. The process itself takes the better part of an afternoon, the family arranged and rearranged in the drawing room where the light falls most evenly, each pose held perfectly still for the better part of a minute at a time, because the slightest movement, a blink, a shift of weight, would blur the entire exposure and require the whole tedious process to begin again. Frederick finds this stillness nearly unbearable, and there is one attempt, later discarded, where his restlessness produces a faint ghostly blur around his hands, that the photographer sighs over with the weary patience of a man who has photographed a great many restless 12-year-olds in his career. Beatrice, by contrast, has learned to hold a pose with real skill, a small, practiced half-smile she has perfected over several previous sittings, though there is something faintly sad, Charlotte thinks privately, in watching her daughter perform stillness quite so expertly, as though this too has become simply one more skill required of a young woman being prepared for public evaluation. The finished portrait, once developed and printed, will hang in the main hallway alongside portraits of Henry's parents and grandparents, a photograph taking its place, oddly, among painted images from an era before photography existed at all, the family's visual history moving seamlessly from oil and canvas to silver and paper without anyone in the house particularly remarking on the strangeness of that transition. Copies will also be sent, in smaller format, to relatives too distant to visit regularly, a way of maintaining presence across distance that Charlotte finds, when she thinks about it, rather moving, this new technology allowing her sister in Liverpool to keep an actual, current likeness of children she sees perhaps twice a year. I find something quietly poignant in imagining that photograph now, more than a century later, the only surviving image of an afternoon that felt, to everyone standing in it, like nothing more than a mildly tedious chore to get through before tea. Health, in a household like this one, is its own quiet category of luxury, and I mean that in a very specific sense, not that wealth guaranteed good health, it plainly did not. Disease in this era paid remarkably little attention to the size of anyone's house, but that wealth guaranteed access, speed, and comfort in ways most of England simply could not imagine. The Ashworths retain a physician, a Dr. Feldman from the nearest market town, on an arrangement that ensures he will attend the family within the hour whenever summoned, day or night, a level of responsiveness that a labouring family in the same town could never dream of securing, waiting instead, often, for whatever charitable dispensary happened to have hours that particular day. When Frederick came down with a fever 2 winters ago, nothing especially serious as it turned out, simply a hard, miserable week of chills and complaint, Dr. Feldman visited every single day until it broke, and a night nurse was brought in from Manchester to sit with him through the worst of it, changing cool cloths on his forehead every 20 minutes through the small hours, so that Charlotte herself might actually sleep rather than maintaining the vigil entirely alone. This is, I think, one of the more overlooked luxuries of this particular world, not simply medicine itself, but the sheer human labour available to absorb the exhausting parts of caregiving that most families were simply left to endure unassisted. There is a dentist too, visited twice yearly in Manchester, and a particular tooth powder Charlotte favours, made with a mild abrasive and a hint of peppermint oil, considerably gentler on the gums than what most households still rely on. Her hands, when she thinks about it, carry almost no evidence of a life that has ever gone genuinely hungry, genuinely cold, or genuinely untreated, a fact so completely woven into her existence that she rarely, if ever, consciously registers it as remarkable at all. It simply is how her life has always worked, the way water simply runs when you turn a tap, without any particular gratitude required for the plumbing behind it. I want to take you below stairs properly now, just for a while, because I think it would be a disservice to tell you this whole story only from the family's side of that green baize door. Mr. Sutcliffe, the butler, has worked at Ashcombe Hall since it was first built, longer than any other member of staff, and he occupies a position of quiet, considerable authority within the household, answering directly to Henry alone, overseeing the male staff, the wine cellar, the silver, and the general smooth functioning of everything that happens on the family side of the house. He is, by most accounts among the staff, a fair man, though a formal one, rarely seen out of his black coat even in the privacy of the servants' hall, maintaining a kind of dignified reserve that some of the younger footmen find intimidating, and that Mrs. Crane, who has worked alongside him for over a decade now, finds simply familiar, the particular steady constant of a colleague she has come to genuinely respect without either of them ever needing to say so directly. Mrs. Abbott, the cook, rules the kitchen with an entirely different energy, warm and loud, and given to sudden sharp bursts of temper that dissolve almost as quickly as they arrive, usually over some minor culinary catastrophe, a sauce that has split, a soufflé that has fallen, disasters that would mean nothing to anyone upstairs, but that Mrs. Abbott takes as genuine personal affronts against her own considerable skill. She trained originally in a much smaller household, working her way up through years of increasingly demanding positions until she finally secured Ashcombe Hall, and there is real pride in her voice whenever she mentions, which she does fairly often, that her kitchen here turns out food that would not embarrass a house twice this size. The servants' hall itself, where the staff take their meals together each evening once the family's own dinner has been cleared, runs on a hierarchy nearly as precise as anything upstairs, seating strictly by rank, the housekeeper and butler at the head of the table, downward through the lady's maid and valet, the footman, the housemaids, finally the scullery maid and the youngest hall boy at the very foot, everyone understanding their place without a single word of it ever needing to be posted on a wall. And yet within that rigid structure there is genuine warmth too, genuine friendship, small private jokes traded across the table, a real community of people who spend more waking hours with each other than most of them will ever spend with their own families, bound together by the strange, particular intimacy of keeping someone else's world running smoothly. There is one more small luxury I want to mention before we move further into the season, because it is the kind of detail that always catches people off guard when they hear it for the first time, and that is the matter of scent. Charlotte does not wear a single fragrance the way most of us might reach for a bottle of perfume today. She has instead a scent composed specifically for her, mixed by a perfumer in London who keeps a formula on file under her name alone, adjusted slightly over the years as her taste has shifted, so that the particular blend of rose, orris root, and a faint trace of something warmer underneath, sandalwood perhaps, though Charlotte has never actually asked and rather likes not knowing, exists nowhere else in the world in quite that exact combination. This is not, strictly speaking, an unusual practice among women of her circle. Louisa has her own formula from a different London house. Even Mrs. Pemberton, Charlotte has noticed, wears something distinct enough that it must surely be her own commissioned blend as well. There is a particular kind of intimacy in this, I think, the idea that a woman's very scent, The thing that lingers in a room after she has already left it might be as deliberately carefully constructed as everything else about her public presentation, and yet remain, in its way, one of the more private things she owns, recognizable to the people who know her best long before they ever see her face. Agnes keeps the bottle in a locked drawer of Charlotte's dressing table, applying it each morning with a small glass stopper rather than Charlotte's own hands, a few careful drops at the wrists, at the base of the throat, enough to be noticed only by anyone standing close, which is, Charlotte has always felt precisely how a scent like this ought to work. Not an announcement, a discovery made only by whoever gets near enough to make it. The family also keeps a smaller house at the coast, in a fashionable resort town in Wales, used mostly during the height of summer, when even a house as comfortable as Ashcombe Hall grows uncomfortably warm. And I think it is worth pausing on this too, because the very idea of owning a second, entirely separate household, fully staffed and maintained year-round, purely for a handful of weeks' occupation each summer, tells you something about the scale of resource this family commands that is easy to lose sight of amid all the smaller, more intimate details of daily life. The seaside house employs its own smaller staff, kept on retainer through the long months when the family is absent, simply to maintain the property against damp, against neglect, ready to open its shutters and air its rooms within a day's notice whenever a telegram arrives announcing the family's imminent arrival. Bathing at the coast follows its own elaborate etiquette entirely distinct from anything at Ashcombe Hall, women changing inside wheeled bathing machines, drawn down to the water's edge by horse, emerging directly into the sea itself rather than crossing any open sand where they might be observed, an entire mechanical apparatus of modesty built purely to allow wealthy women the experience of sea bathing without ever once being visible mid-transition between dry land and water. Charlotte finds the seaside weeks genuinely restorative, more than she generally admits even to Henry, something in the change of air, the different rhythm of days without calling cards or careful precedents to manage, that lets her set down, briefly, a great deal of the constant calculation that governs the rest of her year. Beatrice and Frederick, meanwhile, run rather wilder there than they are permitted at home, sunburned and salt-crusted by the end of most afternoons, and there is a version of this family, visible only during these few weeks each summer, that looks considerably less formal, considerably more like an ordinary happy family on holiday than the carefully arranged social unit they present the rest of the year. I mention it now, out of its proper season, only because I think it matters to hold both versions of this family in your mind at once, the elaborate, precisely calibrated world of the season alongside these looser, salt-air weeks where none of that calibration seems to matter quite so much. Back in Cheshire, as October settles fully over the estate, Beatrice's small friendship with Arthur Wexford has continued, quietly, across several further occasions, a shared box at a concert in Manchester, an afternoon call paid properly and correctly, always with Charlotte or some other appropriate chaperone present. Never once alone, because a young woman's reputation in this world is a fragile thing, easily damaged by even the appearance of impropriety, regardless of how innocent the actual circumstances happen to be. Louisa's daughter has taken to teasing Beatrice gently about it, the particular teasing of girls who have known each other since the nursery, and Beatrice, for her part, protests rather less firmly than she might have a month earlier, which everyone around her, Charlotte included, has quietly noticed without remarking on it directly. There is a particular stage in these things, before anything has actually been decided or declared, when the whole surrounding world seems to hold its breath just slightly, watching, waiting, careful not to name the thing that everyone can nonetheless plainly see forming. Henry has made a few discreet inquiries about the Wexford family, the kind of inquiry a father in his position is expected to make, confirming what he already largely knew, that Arthur, as a second son, will not inherit the family estate itself but stands to receive a comfortable independent income along with reasonable prospects of his own, a career in the law currently being discussed, respectable rather than spectacular, the kind of match that would please without particularly dazzling anyone. Henry finds himself, somewhat to his own surprise, hoping it goes somewhere. He remembers his own courtship of Charlotte with more clarity than he generally lets show, remembers the particular anxious hope of those early weeks, and there is something tender in watching, from a small distance, his daughter perhaps beginning to feel some early version of that same thing. Beatrice has said nothing definite to anyone, not even to Louisa's daughter, though she has, on 2 separate evenings this month, taken the small garnet bracelet from her own jewellery box, the one Charlotte gave her on her 16th birthday, and worn it to occasions where she knew, or at least strongly suspected, that Arthur would be present. Neither of her parents has commented on this pattern. Both of them have noticed it completely. The county's autumn ball, hosted this year by a family called the Hartleys at their own considerably grander house some 6 miles distant, arrives on a clear, cold evening in late October, and it is worth walking through the sheer scale of preparation required simply to get the Ashworth family through the front door of someone else's home for a single evening of dancing. Beatrice's gown for tonight, the blue silk Mrs. Holloway recommended so many weeks ago now, has been finished and pressed and hung ready since the previous afternoon, and getting into it properly takes Agnes and a second housemaid the better part of 2 hours, working through layers most of us would find genuinely difficult to imagine, the fine linen chemise first, then the corset laced to the precise measurement required for this particular gown's cut, then a horsehair crinolet to shape the skirt's fashionable line at the back, then several layers of petticoat, and finally the gown itself, fastened with a long row of small silk-covered buttons running the length of Beatrice's spine that only another person could ever hope to manage. Her hair takes almost as long, arranged by Agnes into an elaborate style, requiring a hidden frame of false hair, a common and entirely unremarkable practice among fashionable women whose own natural hair, however healthy, rarely provides quite enough volume for the current mode. Small white flowers, real ones cut from the conservatory that very morning, are worked carefully through the arrangement, and by the time Beatrice finally stands before her mirror, fully dressed, fully arranged, there is a genuine transformation visible in the reflection, not simply a girl in a pretty dress, but something closer to a small, deliberate work of art. Months of planning and hours of preparation compressed into a single evening's presentation. Charlotte, dressing alongside her in the next room, allows herself a private moment of pure maternal pride watching her daughter descend the staircase a short while later, and there is nothing performative in it at all. Simply the plain, uncomplicated feeling of a mother looking at her child and finding her, quite genuinely, lovely. The Hartleys' ballroom, when the family's carriage finally arrives, is already lit by what must be several hundred candles, arranged in tiered chandeliers that a small army of servants spent the entire preceding day setting and will spend tomorrow morning entirely re-trimming, because a single evening's burning is generally considered all a good beeswax candle can offer before it must be replaced for the next occasion. The floor itself has been specially prepared, chalked and waxed to precisely the right degree of slickness for dancing, a task requiring its own particular expertise that the Hartleys' butler oversees personally, testing the surface himself with a few careful steps before any guest is permitted onto it. Beatrice's dance card fills within the first 20 minutes, a small ivory booklet attached to her wrist by a delicate ribbon, each dance claimed in advance by whichever young man asks first, and there is a particular, quietly thrilling vulnerability in watching a young woman's evening essentially planned out before it has even properly begun, her partner for each dance already determined, already visible to anyone glancing at her wrist. Arthur claims the supper dance, the most significant slot of the evening, the one that guarantees he will lead her into the meal afterward and sit beside her through it, and there is a small, charged exchange of glances between Charlotte and Louisa, seated together along the edge of the room, that neither woman bothers translating into words. The dancing itself runs through waltzes and quadrilles and the newer, faster polkas that some of the more conservative mothers present still regard with mild suspicion, and Beatrice moves through it with genuine pleasure rather than mere performed grace, colour rising in her cheeks that has nothing to do with rouge, which she is not, in any case, permitted to wear at her age. Frederick, too young for the ballroom proper, has been permitted to watch from a small gallery above with several other boys his age, and spends most of the evening considerably more interested in the elaborate ice sculpture melting slowly on the supper table below than in anything happening on the dance floor. By the time the family's carriage pulls back into Ashcombe Hall's long gravel drive, well past 2 in the morning, Beatrice falls asleep against the carriage window somewhere in the last mile, still in her ball gown, the small white flowers wilting now in hair that has come slightly loose, and Charlotte watches her daughter sleep with the particular tenderness of a mother glimpsing, briefly, the child beneath all this careful adult presentation, still there, still very much present even now. There is a room at Ashcombe Hall I have not yet shown you, small, windowless, tucked behind a locked door just off Mr. Sutcliffe's own pantry, and it is here that the family's silver lives when it is not in use, an entire cache of it, candlesticks and epergies and serving dishes and cutlery enough to serve 40 guests at once, all of it catalogued in its own ledger, counted and recounted with an obsessive regularity that says a great deal about how seriously theft, whether by outsiders or by staff, was taken in a household of this size. Mr. Sutcliffe alone holds the key, and the weekly cleaning of this silver falls to a footman under his direct supervision, a slow, careful process using a paste made from precipitated chalk and ammonia that leaves the entire pantry smelling faintly acrid for hours afterward, each piece polished by hand, examined, returned to its exact position in the cabinet, because a missing spoon, however small its actual value, would represent a genuine failure of the household's entire security, a crack in a system built specifically to have no cracks at all. I find myself thinking, whenever I picture this room, about the strange intimacy required of the people who guard a family's wealth without ever really sharing in it. Mr. Sutcliffe has counted this silver every week for over 20 years. He could likely draw the exact layout of that cabinet from memory in his sleep, and yet none of it, not one candlestick, not one serving spoon belongs to him or ever will. His entire professional life organized around the careful, faithful stewardship of objects he touches daily and owns never. There is a particular kind of trust bound up in that arrangement too, though, one that runs in both directions. Henry has never once, in all his years employing Mr. Sutcliffe, personally verified the silver count himself. He simply trusts the ledger, trusts the man who keeps it, in a way that represents its own quiet form of intimacy between two people who otherwise occupy entirely different worlds within the very same house. November arrives at Ashcombe Hall with its own particular shift in mood, the gardens gone bare, the light thinning earlier each afternoon, and it is around this time that Frederick's departure for school finally becomes real rather than simply a date circled on a calendar somewhere in the future. His trunk sits packed in the corner of the schoolroom for nearly a week before the day itself arrives, and there is something almost unbearably poignant, I think, in watching a 12-year-old boy pack away the particular objects of his own childhood, a favourite pocket knife, a small collection of birds' eggs gathered over several summers, a battered copy of an adventure novel he has read so many times the spine has entirely given way. Mr. Aldous, his tutor these past several years, will not be travelling with him. His employment ends the day Frederick leaves, a fact both of them have known for months but that neither has quite discussed directly, and there is an odd, slightly formal warmth to their final lessons together. Mr. Aldous perhaps a touch more generous with praise than usual, Frederick perhaps a touch more attentive than he has ever managed to be before. Charlotte finds this particular transition harder than she expected to, harder, if she is honest with herself, than she has let anyone in the household see. Frederick is not her last child, exactly. Beatrice remains at home for now, but he is her youngest, and there is something final feeling about watching a child leave for a world you cannot follow him into, a school with its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own version of Ashcombe Hall's careful social order that Frederick will now have to learn entirely on his own, without his mother standing nearby to soften any of it. She does not say any of this to Henry directly. She simply spends rather longer than usual, the night before Frederick leaves, sitting on the edge of his bed after he has fallen asleep, watching him breathe in that particular deep, unguarded way children sleep, before quietly closing the door and going to find that small worn prayer book in the bottom drawer of her own desk, needing, for reasons she does not fully examine, to hold something old and familiar in her hands that night. The morning Frederick leaves is bright and cold, frost still silvering the lawn when the carriage is brought round, and the whole household seems to gather, unofficially, to see him off. Mrs. Abbott appearing at the kitchen door with a small parcel of biscuits pressed into his hands for the journey, Dobbs checking the carriage harness with rather more care than the short trip to the station strictly requires, Agnes lingering near the front steps with an expression she does her best to keep composed. Henry travels with him as far as the station himself, a small gesture that surprises nobody who knows him well, whatever formal distance he maintains with his son in daily life dissolving almost entirely for this particular morning. Charlotte says her goodbye at the front steps instead, kneeling briefly to straighten Frederick's collar, in a gesture that is really more about her own hands needing something to do than about the collar actually requiring any adjustment at all. And there is a moment, brief and entirely private between the two of them, where Frederick, normally so determined to seem older than his years, simply lets his mother hold him a beat longer than strictly necessary, before pulling back with the particular effortful dignity of a boy who does not want to cry in front of the assembled household staff. Charlotte tells him to write to her properly, not just to ask for things, and Frederick, hesitating just slightly, promises that he will, mostly. She laughs despite herself, and that laugh, I think, is exactly the note she wanted to send him off on, something light enough to carry with him, rather than the heavier thing she is actually feeling underneath it. The carriage pulls away down the long curved drive, past the transplanted trees that have never once in Frederick's entire lifetime looked anything other than fully grown, and Charlotte stands on the front steps rather longer than necessary, watching it go, before Mrs. Crane appears quietly at her elbow with a question about the week's linen order, the ordinary rhythm of the house already gently reasserting itself around her. Winter, when it finally settles fully over Cheshire in December, brings its own particular category of luxury into sharper focus, because warmth itself, real, consistent warmth throughout an entire large house, was never a given in this century, not even for families as comfortable as the Ashworths. Ashcombe Hall burns through an almost staggering quantity of coal each winter month, fires kept lit in every room the family regularly occupies, tended constantly by housemaids whose entire morning routine, before the family is even woken, involves working room to room, raking out old ash, laying fresh coal, coaxing each grate back to life so that by the time anyone actually enters a room, the chill has already been chased well out of it. Most English households, even reasonably comfortable ones, heat perhaps 1 or 2 rooms properly through winter, everyone gathering close together in whichever room holds the fire, bedrooms left cold enough that frost sometimes forms on the inside of the windows by morning. At Ashcombe Hall, Charlotte's bedroom fire burns through the night as well, tended by whichever housemaid draws that particular duty, creeping in quietly every few hours to add coal without ever fully waking the family, a service so specifically designed around invisibility that Charlotte has genuinely never once, in all her years in this house, woken to see it happen. There are hot water bottles too, stoneware ones wrapped in flannel, tucked into the beds a full hour before anyone retires, so that climbing beneath the covers each night means settling into warmth already waiting for you, rather than the slow, shivering process of warming the sheets yourself with your own body heat, which remains, for most of England this same winter, simply how a cold bed becomes a warm one. Furs too come out this season, Charlotte's own collection including a sable-lined cloak that cost, several years ago now, more than most families in the village nearby would see in 2 full years of combined wages, worn not simply for warmth. Ordinary wool could manage that well enough, but for the specific unmistakable statement that sable makes the moment anyone sees it, a statement understood instantly and completely by anyone in her circle and largely invisible, in its particular meaning, to anyone outside it. Christmas at Ashcombe Hall, when it finally arrives, unfolds according to traditions that feel, to Charlotte and Henry, both timeless and, if they are honest with themselves, considerably newer than they generally let on. The Christmas tree itself, standing in the Great Hall this year, as it has every year since Beatrice was a small child, decorated with candles clipped carefully onto its branches and small glass ornaments imported from Germany, remains a relatively recent fashion in England, popularised only in the last several decades, and still, in more modest households across the country, something of a novelty rather than an established custom. Mrs. Abbott's kitchen has been at work for nearly a full week preparing for the day itself, the Christmas pudding actually made and set aside back in November, according to tradition, to allow it time to properly mature, each member of the household given the chance to stir it once and make a private wish while doing so, a small democratic ritual that briefly, cheerfully, dissolves the household's usual hierarchy for exactly as long as the stirring spoon takes to pass from hand to hand. Even Mr. Sutcliffe stirs it, with what Charlotte privately considers a rather touching, uncharacteristic softness in his usually formal expression. Frederick has been given leave from school for the holiday, arriving home 2 days before Christmas with a self-satisfied swagger that suggests his first term has gone considerably better than the nervous packed trunk boy who left in November might have predicted, full of stories about a rugby match, a strict housemaster, a friend named Collins who Charlotte gathers, from the sheer frequency of his mention, has become rather important to her son this term. She listens to all of it with genuine pleasure, noticing, with a small private ache she does not mention, how much taller he seems already, how his voice has begun, just barely, to catch and deepen in places it did not a few months earlier. Presents are opened on Christmas morning after church, modest by later standards though generous for their time. A new saddle for Frederick's pony, a set of watercolours Beatrice has been quietly wanting for months, and for Charlotte, from Henry, a small brooch set with a single sapphire that he presents without any particular ceremony, simply placing the box in her hands over breakfast with an expression that tries, not entirely successfully, to appear casual about the whole thing. She knows, without needing to be told, exactly how much thought went into choosing it. Christmas dinner itself gathers the extended family, Charlotte's sister travelling down from Liverpool for the occasion, along with her own husband and children, filling the dining room to a capacity it rarely sees on ordinary nights, and there is a particular warmth to this crowded table that Charlotte finds herself treasuring rather more than the more elegant, precisely calibrated dinner parties that fill most of her calendar. Nobody here is being evaluated, nobody's seating requires careful thought about precedence. It is simply family, loud and overlapping, and entirely without pretense, and Charlotte watches Henry laughing at something her sister's husband has said, head thrown back in a way he rarely allows himself among his usual social circle, and thinks, not for the first time, that this particular kind of unguarded happiness might be the truest luxury this house actually contains. Beatrice sits beside her cousin, a girl close to her own age, and the two of them fall into the easy, giggling closeness of cousins who see each other perhaps twice a year, but pick up every time as though no time has passed at all. There is a moment, midway through the meal, when Beatrice catches her mother's eye across the table, and something passes silently between them, a small private acknowledgement neither of them chooses to name out loud, of everything the last several months have held, the fittings, the fear underneath all that careful presentation, the season still fully ahead of her, even as this one small warm evening offers a brief pause from it. Snow begins falling outside sometime after the pudding has been served, thick and steady against the tall windows of the dining room, and Frederick abandons the table entirely partway through dessert to press his face against the cold glass, watching it settle over the lawn where, only a few months earlier, he had chased a calf and scraped his knuckle and come home muddy and thrilled about an entirely different kind of afternoon. Charlotte watches him watching the snow, and there is something in the stillness of that particular moment, the whole noisy table behind him, the quiet white world gathering just beyond the glass, that she suspects she will remember for a very long time, longer, probably, than she will remember most of the season's grander, more elaborate occasions. New Year's Eve brings a smaller gathering, just a handful of close neighbouring families invited for supper and cards, and it is on this particular evening, with the fires burning low and comfortable, and the year's more demanding obligations finally behind them for a few short weeks, that Charlotte allows herself something close to genuine relaxation, playing whist rather badly with Louisa as her partner, losing more hands than she wins, and minding it considerably less than she would at almost any other card table she sits down at throughout the rest of the year. There is a particular luxury, I think, in an evening that asks nothing of you beyond simple enjoyment, no precedents to calculate, no young men to quietly evaluate on your daughter's behalf, no careful diplomatic welcome to extend to a still uncertain new neighbour, just cards and conversation and the specific comfortable pleasure of people who have known each other long enough to stop performing quite so carefully around one another. Arthur Wexford is not present tonight, his own family keeping their own smaller New Year's tradition several counties away, and Beatrice mentions this only once, in passing, with a studied casualness that fools nobody in the room, least of all her mother. Charlotte says nothing about it directly, simply passes her daughter a plate of the little iced cakes Mrs. Abbott prepared for the occasion, and there is an entire conversation folded into that small, wordless gesture that neither of them needs to say out loud. At midnight, the household gathers briefly in the front hall, servants included, a rare moment when the usual boundaries soften just slightly, everyone raising a small glass together as the clock strikes 12, Mr. Sutcliffe permitting himself an actual smile, Frederick, home still for a few more days before returning to school, whooping rather louder than strictly dignified until Henry catches his eye with mock severity that neither of them takes remotely seriously. It is a small moment, over within a few minutes, everyone returning to their proper places soon after, but I think there is something worth noticing in it all the same, this brief, deliberate collapsing of an entire elaborate social structure into something considerably simpler, if only for the length of a single toast. Winter loosens its grip gradually across the following months, and by the time the first genuinely warm afternoon arrives in March, the household's attention has already begun turning, inexorably, toward the season proper. The actual move to London still weeks away, but its preparations already well underway. Wardrobe trunks pulled down from storage, the Belgravia townhouse's caretaker written to and instructed to begin airing rooms that have sat closed since the previous summer. It is on one of these early spring afternoons, walking together through the kitchen gardens where the first bulbs are just beginning to show, that Arthur Wexford finally says the thing everyone around Beatrice has been quietly anticipating for months now. Charlotte and Louisa, walking a discreet distance behind, watch the two young people stop beneath the bare branches of an old apple tree, watch Arthur reach for Beatrice's hand, watch, from this careful, deliberate distance, a conversation neither of them can actually hear, but both of them can read perfectly well regardless. Beatrice comes to find her mother a short while later, cheeks flushed with cold and something considerably warmer than cold, and there is a moment, just before she says anything at all, where Charlotte already knows, has known really for weeks now, and simply waits, letting her daughter arrive at the words in her own time. He asked her, Beatrice says, with a small disbelieving laugh caught somewhere in her voice, telling her mother, in something close to wonder, that he actually asked her. Charlotte does not even need to ask what answer she gave. Charlotte pulls her daughter into an embrace that neither of them for once worries about wrinkling anyone's gown over, and there is a particular fullness to this moment that I think deserves to be named plainly, without any careful social calculation layered over it at all. A mother's daughter, choosing, this time, someone she actually wants, within a system that offered her precious little real choice in almost everything else. It will still require Henry's formal approval, still require careful negotiation between the two families regarding settlements and arrangements neither young person has any real say in, but underneath all of that necessary machinery, there is unmistakably something genuine here, and Charlotte, holding her daughter close beneath the bare apple tree, finds herself simply grateful for it, more than she has words ready to say. The formal negotiations that follow Beatrice's engagement reveal a side of Victorian marriage that romantic novels tend to skip over entirely, though it runs, quite literally, underneath every single one of the courtships they describe. Henry and Arthur's father spend the better part of 2 weeks in correspondence and eventually a direct meeting, working out what is called the marriage settlement, a legal document specifying exactly what money, property and income each family brings to the union and precisely how it will be protected, particularly for Beatrice herself. This is not, whatever it might sound like, a cold or unromantic process from Henry's perspective. It is, in his understanding of the world, the single most important thing he can do for his daughter's actual security, considerably more important, in practical terms, than any of the romantic sentiment surrounding the engagement itself. Beatrice's settlement will include a sum set aside entirely for her own use, controlled by trustees rather than by Arthur directly, a protection specifically designed to ensure that whatever happens across the course of her marriage, financial difficulty, an unwise investment, any of the ordinary risks a husband's decisions might expose a family to. Beatrice herself will retain some independent resource that cannot simply be spent away or lost on her behalf. Henry takes this negotiation with a seriousness that surprises Beatrice slightly. Watching her father, usually so easy and unhurried, spend entire evenings in his study poring over documents with an intensity she associates more with his old mill business than with anything she has seen from him in years. She does not fully understand, at 17, just how much of this careful legal architecture exists specifically to protect her. A young woman about to hand her entire legal and financial identity, under the law as it currently stands, into her husband's keeping the moment she marries him. Charlotte understands it considerably better, having lived through her own version of these same negotiations nearly 2 decades earlier, and there is a particular kind of vigilance in how closely she reviews the final settlement herself, reading every clause with an attention that Henry, watching her, finds himself genuinely grateful for, even as he privately admits she has caught 2 small ambiguities in the wording that his own solicitor entirely missed. Once the settlement is finally agreed, the engagement can be properly announced, and attention turns almost immediately to trousseau, an entire category of luxury I have not mentioned yet tonight, though it represents one of the largest single expenses Charlotte will oversee for her daughter across the whole of this year. A trousseau for a young woman of Beatrice's position means an entirely new wardrobe assembled specifically for married life, dozens of garments covering every conceivable occasion a wife will need to be dressed for across the coming years. Morning dresses and afternoon dresses and dinner gowns, undergarments in quantities that would strike most households as almost absurd, a dozen or more of everything, monogrammed now, with a new set of initials that will belong to Beatrice only after her wedding day. A small, strange detail that catches her off guard the first time she sees the stitched letters, her future name rendered in thread before she has even fully grown accustomed to saying it aloud herself. Mrs. Holloway travels up from London considerably more often over these weeks, and the fittings, when Beatrice stands for them now, carry an entirely different quality than the ones from the previous autumn, less anxious, less freighted with the uncertain question of whether this whole elaborate machinery would actually produce the outcome it was built for. It has. The dresses being pinned and adjusted now exist for a future that already has a shape, a husband already chosen, a life already, in its broad outlines, decided. There is a particular piece among the trousseau that Charlotte insists on herself, over Beatrice's mild protest that it seems an unnecessary extravagance, a set of fine linen sheets embroidered with both initials entwined together, meant specifically for the wedding night itself, and Beatrice, examining the careful stitching one evening in her mother's sitting room, finds herself unexpectedly moved by the sheer, quiet tenderness folded into an object so purely practical on its surface. Her mother chose this thread colour herself. Her mother sat with the seamstress and specified exactly how the 2 sets of initials should intertwine. It is, in its way, one of the more genuinely personal gifts in an entire trousseau, otherwise built almost entirely around formal, impersonal expense. The wedding itself is set for June, timed deliberately to fall before the full crush of the London season reaches its peak, and as spring deepens toward that date, Ashcombe Hall settles into a particular kind of purposeful, happy business that Charlotte finds herself enjoying rather more than she expected to, given how much actual work it requires of her. The guest list alone runs to over 200 names, each one weighed carefully against questions of family obligation, social standing, and genuine personal affection, a document that takes Charlotte and Mrs. Crane the better part of a week to finalise between them. Beatrice's wedding gown, when it finally arrives from Mrs. Holloway's workshop, is made of ivory silk rather than the more traditional white, a fabric so fine and so carefully constructed that it takes 3 fittings simply to achieve the correct fall of the train, and Charlotte finds herself watching her daughter stand before the mirror in it for the first time, unexpectedly unable to speak for a moment, an experience so unfamiliar to her usual composed self that Agnes, present for the fitting, discreetly busies herself with something in the corner of the room to allow Charlotte a private moment to recover. The church itself, the same small stone building where Beatrice was christened 17 years earlier, will be decorated with flowers from the estate's own gardens and greenhouses, hundreds of them, arranged over 2 full days by a team that includes both the regular household staff and several additional women hired specifically for the occasion from the village. The wedding breakfast afterward will be held at Ashcombe Hall itself, a marquee erected on the great lawn where croquet was played only the previous autumn, capable of seating well over 100 guests beneath striped canvas, an entire temporary structure assembled, decorated, and provisioned purely for a single afternoon's celebration before being dismantled again within the week. Henry, walking through the preparations one afternoon in early June, finds himself struck by the sheer scale of what they have built for this one day, and there is a moment, standing beneath the half-finished marquee with sawdust still scattered across the grass, where he thinks, with a clarity that surprises him, that none of it, not the flowers, not the silk, not the 200 careful invitations, actually matters half as much as the plain fact that his daughter is marrying a man who makes her laugh easily and often. He does not say this thought aloud to anyone. He simply carries it with him back into the house, quietly, the way he carries most of what he genuinely feels. On the morning of the wedding itself, the house wakes earlier than usual, a particular quality of light and quiet urgency moving through every room long before the sun has fully cleared the tree line. Agnes is in Beatrice's room by 6, and the dressing that follows takes the better part of 3 hours, not from any single garment being especially complicated, but from the sheer weight of care everyone involved brings to getting every single detail exactly right, the veil pinned and repinned until it falls at precisely the correct angle, the small string of pearls, a gift from Henry, fastened and checked twice. Charlotte sits with her daughter for a quiet stretch in the middle of all this preparation, sending Agnes briefly from the room on some invented errand, simply to buy the two of them a few minutes alone, and there is a conversation that passes between them in this small window of time that neither woman will ever fully repeat to anyone else, mother to daughter, the kind of plain, unguarded talk about marriage, about partnership, about the particular private negotiations of a shared life that no amount of legal settlement or careful trousseau could ever fully prepare a young woman for on its own. Charlotte does not remember, afterward, every word she said. She remembers, mostly, holding both of her daughter's hands and feeling, quite suddenly, considerably older than she had felt only the day before. The ceremony itself passes, as these things tend to, faster than anyone quite expects given the months of preparation behind it. Beatrice walking the short aisle on Henry's arm with a composure that only occasionally flickers into something more visibly emotional, Arthur waiting at the front with an expression Charlotte finds genuinely moving to watch, not performed at all, simply plain, uncomplicated happiness. Frederick, home again for the occasion and considerably taller than he was even at Christmas, stands near the front looking faintly uncomfortable in his formal clothes and entirely unable to stop grinning throughout the entire service. Afterward, beneath the striped marquee on the great lawn, champagne flows freely, toasts are made, and Beatrice moves through her own wedding breakfast in a soft, slightly disbelieving daze that Charlotte remembers well from her own wedding day, that particular sensation of being simultaneously the centre of an enormous, carefully orchestrated event, and somehow, privately, entirely alone inside a moment too large to fully absorb all at once. Speeches follow the meal itself, Henry rising first, his voice steadier than he expected it to be, given how much emotion he has been quietly carrying all morning, speaking briefly and plainly about his daughter, about the particular pride of watching a child grow into a woman who chose her own path, even within a world that offered her precious little room to choose anything at all. Arthur's father speaks next, warmer and considerably longer than strictly necessary, and there is laughter throughout the marquee at a story about Arthur as a boy that Beatrice will apparently be hearing repeated at family gatherings for the rest of her married life. The cake, when it finally arrives, is a triumph of Mrs. Abbott's considerable skill. 3 tiers of rich fruit cake beneath a shell of hard white icing so smooth it looks, from a distance, almost like carved stone, decorated with small sugar flowers that took 2 of the kitchen staff the better part of 3 days to complete. Beatrice and Arthur cut it together, hands overlapping on the handle of a knife that has, as it happens, been in the Ashworth family for 3 generations, used at Henry's own wedding and his father's before him, a small continuous thread running through this one particular family across considerably more time than the house itself has stood. By late afternoon, as the light over the lawn begins to soften into that particular gold that only seems to arrive in early June, Beatrice changes into a travelling dress for the journey that will take her and Arthur to the coast for a short wedding trip before they settle into the house Arthur has taken for them near London. The goodbye at the front steps runs longer than anyone quite planned for, Charlotte holding her daughter close, Frederick uncharacteristically solemn for a moment, hugging his sister with real feeling before immediately undercutting the sentiment with some teasing remark about her new husband that makes her laugh despite the tears still standing in her eyes. The carriage pulls away down the same long curved drive Frederick's own carriage travelled at that cold November morning, past the same mature transplanted trees, and Charlotte stands watching it go with an entirely different quality of feeling than she carried that earlier day. Not loss exactly, though there is some of that folded in too, but something closer to a kind of full, aching completion, watching a piece of her own life step forward into a future she helped build but will no longer fully inhabit alongside her. The house feels strange that first evening after the wedding, quieter in a way that has nothing to do with the usual careful engineering of silence Ashcombe Hall has always specialised in, and everything to do with the simple fact that Beatrice's particular presence, her laugh carrying down the corridor from the conservatory, her footsteps on the stairs at odd hours, is now genuinely, permanently absent from the daily texture of the place. Charlotte finds herself, over the following weeks, occasionally starting toward her daughter's old room with some small piece of news or gossip, before remembering, each time with a fresh small jolt, that there is nobody there anymore to receive it. Henry notices this adjustment in his wife with more attentiveness than he generally shows for such things, and there is a particular evening, perhaps 3 weeks after the wedding, when he suggests, without any special occasion prompting it, that the two of them dine alone in the small breakfast room rather than the formal dining room, just the two of them, no particular reason given, and Charlotte understands immediately what he is actually offering her, a quiet acknowledgement that this new, smaller shape of their household deserves its own gentle attention rather than simply being absorbed into the house's existing rhythms without comment. There is a letter from Beatrice within the fortnight, the first of what will become a long, steady correspondence between mother and daughter across the coming years, describing her new house near London, with an enthusiasm that makes Charlotte smile even as she reads it alone at her own writing desk. The same desk, the same watermarked paper, though the handwriting arriving now carries a new set of initials at the bottom that Charlotte still finds faintly startling every time she sees them. Married life suits her, Beatrice writes, though she confesses, in a passage that makes Charlotte laugh out loud in the quiet of her own sitting room, that she has already had her first genuine argument with Arthur over something so small and ridiculous, involving the correct placement of a hall table, that neither of them can quite remember afterward what the actual disagreement was even about. Charlotte writes back at length that same afternoon, offering the kind of practical, affectionate advice one married woman offers another, and there is something in the simple act of it, mother and daughter now writing to each other as two grown women managing their own households rather than as parent and child, that Charlotte finds unexpectedly moving, a relationship reshaping itself into something new without losing any of what it always was underneath. Summer returns to Ashcombe Hall the way it always does, gradually and then all at once, the conservatory's orange trees heavy with fruit again, the ice house running low by August the way it always runs low, the lawn where croquet was played, and where Beatrice once caught Arthur's eye now simply ordinary green grass again, waiting for whatever comes next. Frederick arrives home for the long summer break taller still, his voice fully settled now into something recognisably approaching a man's, full of stories about a cricket match and a schoolboy rivalry that seems, to Charlotte's ear, both entirely trivial and completely, movingly important to him. There is a particular pleasure Charlotte has come to notice in herself this second summer without Beatrice at home, a settling into a version of this house that feels, if not smaller exactly, then differently shaped, quieter in its rhythms but not emptier for it. She spends more time in the conservatory herself now, in the wicker chair Beatrice used to favour, reading rather less scandalous material than her daughter once hid beneath her mattress, though she has, on one or two occasions, borrowed one of those very novels from Beatrice's old room out of a curiosity she would never fully admit to anyone. Agnes remains with her, of course. The two women's relationship settled now into a comfortable, familiar rhythm built across 7 years of shared mornings, and there is a particular evening this summer, quite late, when Charlotte finds herself asking Agnes almost impulsively whether she has ever thought of marrying herself, a question that crosses a line neither woman usually acknowledges exists between mistress and maid. Agnes considers the question seriously for a moment before answering, honestly, that she has once or twice, though nothing ever came of it, and there is something in the quiet, unguarded exchange that follows, two women talking plainly about their own private lives for once, rather than managing anyone else's, that neither of them mentions again afterward, though both of them, I think, remember it. The house at night, in these warm summer weeks, carries its own particular texture that I want to leave you with for a while now, because I think it captures something true about this entire world we have spent so long inside together tonight. Long after the family has retired, the last fire banked, the last candle extinguished, there remains a particular quality of settled stillness that moves through Ashcombe Hall's corridors, wood floors that have finished creaking with the day's last footsteps, curtains hanging motionless in windows left slightly open to the warm night air, the faint, lingering smell of beeswax polish and cut flowers that never fully leaves any room in this house, no matter how many hours pass since anyone last tended it. Let me walk you through this house one more time before we let it rest. Slowly now, room by room, the way you might walk through a house you have come to know rather well over the course of a long evening spent inside it. In the kitchen, banked low for the night, Mrs. Abbott's great iron range still holds a faint residual warmth, enough that a cat belonging to one of the scullery maids has claimed its usual spot on a folded blanket nearby, curled into a tight, contented circle, entirely undisturbed by the vast, sleeping house around it. The copper pots hang in their careful rows along the far wall, catching whatever thin moonlight manages to find its way through the high, small windows set close to the ceiling, and there is a stillness in this room now that stands in complete contrast to its daytime clatter and heat, the whole space holding its breath until morning. Up the back stairs, past the green baize door standing slightly ajar tonight, in the particular way it sometimes does when the last servant through forgets, quite understandably, to pull it fully closed behind them. The main hallway stretches out in shadow, the family portraits along its walls reduced now to soft dark shapes rather than distinguishable faces. Henry's father, watching over nothing in particular from his frame above the library door, the recently hung photograph of the whole family taking its own quiet place among paintings considerably older than itself. In the library, the fire has gone out entirely, and the room holds that particular cool, leather-bound stillness that libraries seem to keep even in the height of summer. 3,000 books standing in their careful ranks, most of them silent and unopened, waiting, as they have waited for years now, for someone to finally take them down. Frederick's illustrated volumes about explorers sit exactly where he left them on the lower shelf, a thin layer of the day's dust already beginning to settle over their spines, though he will be back for them again before the summer is finished. Up on the second floor, the schoolroom stands empty now, in a way that feels different from its usual daytime emptiness. Mr. Aldous long since gone to a new position, the globes and specimen boxes still arranged carefully along their shelves, waiting, perhaps, for a future child of this house who has not yet been born, or perhaps simply destined to remain here, gathering dust, a small monument to two childhoods that have already, in their different ways, largely moved past this particular room's careful, plain furniture. In Charlotte's own bedroom, the fire has been banked low rather than extinguished entirely, tended a final time by whichever housemaid drew tonight's duty, and Charlotte herself lies mostly asleep already. The small worn prayer book returned to its drawer an hour or so earlier, her breathing slow and even beneath the same heavy blankets that have kept this family warm through every winter this house has known. Henry sleeps beside her, one hand loosely resting near hers across the narrow space between their pillows, neither of them touching exactly, but close enough that either one, waking in the night, would find the other immediately, without needing to search. Higher still, on the top floor where the ceilings slope down close beneath the roofline, the servants' quarters hold their own particular version of nighttime quiet. Smaller rooms, plainer furniture, but sleep here, I think, comes just as completely as it does in the grander rooms below. Agnes lies in her narrow bed, with a book still open, face down, on the small table beside her, having fallen asleep mid-page the way she often does after a long day. The candle she was reading by burnt down now to a stub that will need replacing before tomorrow night. Down the corridor, the younger housemaids share a room between them, their whispered conversation from earlier in the evening long since given way to the particular deep, dreamless sleep of people who rise before dawn and work with their hands and bodies all day long. Mr. Sutcliffe keeps a small private room of his own near the top of the back stairs, a privilege of his long service and senior position, and there is a particular orderliness even to his sleeping quarters that matches the man himself, his black coat hung with precise care, his few personal possessions arranged with the same exactness he brings to counting the household silver each week. Mrs. Crane, in her own room nearby, keeps the household's master ledger locked in a small case beside her bed, close enough to reach without rising, a habit built across 11 years of feeling, even in sleep, faintly responsible for every detail of this enormous house's smooth functioning. Outside, past the kitchen gardens, the stable block holds its own quiet nighttime rhythm entirely apart from the house itself, 6 carriage horses shifting occasionally in their stalls, the soft, steady sound of large animals breathing and settling, Dobbs asleep in his own small quarters above the coach house, one ear tuned, even in sleep, to any sound of genuine trouble among his horses, though tonight, as on most nights, there is none. The ice house sits sealed and silent beneath its mound of earth, its dwindling summer stock slowly, imperceptibly shrinking in the dark. The conservatory's glass walls hold the day's trapped warmth a little longer than the rest of the house manages, orange trees and orchids breathing quietly through the night in their own small, humid pocket of borrowed tropical air, entirely unaware, in whatever way a plant can be said to be aware of anything, of how far they are from wherever they actually belong. I want to take you, just briefly, into Beatrice's own new household near London, because there is something worth noticing in how a young woman raised inside one particular version of luxury goes about building her own, slightly different version of it for herself. Her house is considerably smaller than Ashcombe Hall, of course, Arthur's income comfortable rather than substantial, and she manages, in these early months of her marriage, with a staff of only 4 rather than the 17 she grew up surrounded by, a cook, a housemaid, a manservant for Arthur, and a girl who comes in daily to help with the heavier cleaning. It would be easy to assume this represents some kind of diminishment, and in the strictest financial sense, perhaps it does. But Beatrice, writing to her mother that first autumn of her marriage, describes a particular satisfaction in running this smaller household herself, hands-on in a way Charlotte's own far grander establishment never really required or permitted of her. Beatrice knows her own cook's recipes. She has learned, out of genuine necessity rather than choice, considerably more about household accounts than her mother ever had to master directly, Mrs. Crane having always handled the finer details at Ashcombe Hall. There is a particular pride in her letters that Charlotte recognises, reading them, as something close to her own younger self, before wealth and position had fully smoothed away whatever rougher, more practical competence she once carried from her own mother's draper's shop. Beatrice keeps her own version of the household silver in a considerably smaller cabinet, counts it herself rather than delegating the task, and there is something in this that Charlotte finds herself admiring more than she quite expected to, a granddaughter of shopkeepers, in a sense, choosing to keep at least one hand actively on the mechanics of her own comfortable life, rather than letting every practical detail dissolve entirely into invisible, hired competence. Not every luxury translates directly from one generation to the next, in other words. Some habits loosen, some standards shift, gently, according to circumstance and temperament, rather than strict inheritance. And I think there is something quietly hopeful in that, watching a family's particular relationship to wealth and comfort evolve, generation by generation, into something that still resembles what came before it, but is never quite identical to it either. There is one more room at Ashcombe Hall I have not properly shown you yet. A long gallery on the first floor, lined with paintings that Henry's father began collecting in earnest during a lengthy trip through Italy some 30 years ago now, before the house itself was even built, acquiring landscapes and a handful of smaller devotional works from dealers in Florence and Rome, with the particular eager enthusiasm of a self-made man determined to fill his future home with exactly the kind of cultural weight that new money on its own could never quite manufacture from nothing. Henry has added to this collection only modestly since inheriting it: a few English landscapes purchased at auction, a portrait of Charlotte herself commissioned not long after their marriage that hangs now at the gallery's far end, and there is something in walking this corridor, as Charlotte sometimes does on quiet afternoons, that feels almost like walking through a carefully curated version of the family's own aspirations, laid out in oil paint and gilt frames. Each purchase a small, deliberate statement about exactly what kind of family the Ashworths intended to become. I find myself thinking, whenever I picture this gallery, about a particular kind of luxury we have not quite named yet tonight, though it runs beneath almost everything I have described to you, and that is simply time itself, the sheer uncontested abundance of it that wealth makes possible. Charlotte can walk this gallery on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason beyond her own pleasure, examining a painting she has looked at 100 times before, because nothing in her day requires her attention more urgently elsewhere. A woman in the village, by complete contrast, measures her own day in considerably narrower units: water fetched, bread baked, children minded, mending finished before the light fails, every hour already spoken for by necessity long before she wakes. This is not, I think, a small or incidental difference between these two lives. It might in fact be the truest luxury of all, more fundamental even than the diamonds or the ice house or the silk gowns, this simple, enormous privilege of time that belongs entirely to yourself, hours you may spend however you please, examining a painting, reading a novel hidden beneath a mattress, sitting quietly in a conservatory full of orange trees that have no earthly business growing in Cheshire at all. Everything else we have talked about tonight, in a sense, is simply this one deeper luxury, expressed 100 different ways across 100 different rooms. Frederick, by the following autumn, has grown enough that talk has already begun, quietly, between Henry and Mr. Aldous' eventual successor at his school, about which university might suit him best when the time comes, Oxford or Cambridge, the particular college, the particular course of study a young man in his position might reasonably pursue. He shows an interest, to Henry's quiet satisfaction, in the actual mechanics of the family's remaining mill interests, asking questions on his visits home that suggest a mind considerably more practical than Beatrice's own had ever been, more inclined toward numbers and systems than toward novels and needlework. Henry finds himself, watching his son's growing interest, thinking rather more often these days about his own father, gone now for nearly a decade, and about the particular weight of inheritance that runs not just through property and money, but through temperament itself, passed down in ways nobody ever quite chooses or fully controls. His father built this house from nothing but ambition and considerable good fortune in the cotton trade. Henry has spent his own adult life largely preserving what his father built rather than expanding it much further, a choice he has occasionally wondered whether his father would have respected or quietly resented, given how restlessly ambitious the old man remained until his final years. There is a particular evening, walking the long gallery with Frederick home for a few days between school terms, when Henry finds himself saying some version of this thought aloud for the first time, standing before his own father's portrait, admitting to his son, in a rare unguarded moment, that he has never fully decided whether he considers himself a worthy successor to the man in that frame, or simply a careful, comfortable caretaker of someone else's more considerable achievement. Frederick, at 13 now, does not have a ready answer for this, and to his credit does not pretend to offer one. He simply stands beside his father a while longer, looking up at the same painted face, and there is something in the shared quiet of that moment, 2 generations considering a third, that neither of them needs to resolve tonight, or perhaps ever, in order for it to matter. Sunday mornings at Ashcombe Hall follow their own fixed, unhurried ritual, the family walking together, weather permitting, the short distance to the same small stone church where Beatrice was married, where Frederick was christened, where the Ashworth family occupies its own private pew near the front, set apart by a low wooden rail and cushioned in a deep red velvet that no other family in the parish can claim for their own seating. This particular arrangement, a family's permanent reserved place within the church itself, purchased and maintained through an annual pew rent that most of the surrounding congregation could never hope to afford, represents its own quiet, long-standing form of visible status, a physical demonstration, repeated every single week, of exactly where this family sits within the parish's understood order of things. The vicar, a mild, scholarly man named Reverend Ashby, who has held this living for nearly 20 years, tailors his sermons with a certain careful awareness of his congregation's composition, mindful that the Ashworths' continued generosity toward the church roof fund and the parish school depends, at least in part, on his maintaining a comfortable, uncontroversial relationship with the family occupying that velvet-cushioned pew each week. Charlotte has never fully examined how much this quiet mutual understanding shapes what she actually hears from the pulpit each Sunday, though I suspect, if she thought about it carefully, she would find the sermons here rather gentler on subjects of wealth and its obligations than Reverend Ashby's own private theological convictions might otherwise incline him toward. Afterward, the family returns home to a cold luncheon, Sunday being traditionally a lighter day in the kitchen, out of respect for the servants' own need for at least partial rest, though partial, in a household this size, still means a considerable amount of ongoing labour simply to keep the family fed and comfortable. Charlotte spends most Sunday afternoons with her needlework, a particular fine embroidery she has worked at steadily for months now, a christening gown intended, though she has told nobody this directly, for whatever grandchild Beatrice might eventually give her, worked in a pattern of small white flowers not unlike the ones that filled her daughter's hair on her wedding day. Mrs. Pemberton, whose slow, careful entry into this particular social world I mentioned so much earlier tonight, has by this point become a genuinely established fixture among Charlotte's circle, invited now without any of the earlier hesitation, her own daughter, still quite young, already being spoken of, in the particular long-term way these things get spoken of, as a potential future match for some suitable young man not yet even identified. Charlotte finds herself watching this slow transformation complete itself over the better part of 2 years, thinking rather often about how strange and how entirely predictable the whole process has been, an outsider gradually, patiently absorbed into a structure that never once officially acknowledged excluding her in the first place. There is a particular afternoon, the two women taking tea together in Charlotte's smaller drawing room, when Mrs. Pemberton, whose first name Charlotte has only recently earned the right to actually use, mentions with a small wry smile that she remembers with perfect clarity the exact date Charlotte first called on her, remembers counting the weeks beforehand, remembers understanding precisely what that delay had meant, and choosing, deliberately, not to resent it, because resenting it would have accomplished nothing beyond making her own eventual acceptance considerably harder to secure. Charlotte finds this admission both faintly uncomfortable and, in its own way, rather moving. An honest acknowledgement, finally, of a game both women have spent considerable energy playing without ever once naming it directly to each other before now. She tells her plainly that she is sorry it took so long, and means it more than she perhaps expected to when the thought first began forming. Pemberton sets down her cup and tells her not to be sorry, that she understands it a good deal better now than she did when she first arrived, and that she would likely have done exactly the same in Charlotte's position. It is, I think, a small, quiet moment of genuine honesty between two women who have spent most of their acquaintance speaking carefully around exactly the kind of truth they are finally, briefly allowing themselves to say plainly. Travel itself, when the family journeys to London each spring for the season, carries its own particular texture of hidden luxury that I have not yet described to you. Henry maintains a standing arrangement with the railway company for a private compartment on the regular service down from Manchester, a small additional expense that spares the family the ordinary crowded discomfort of sharing a carriage with strangers, allowing Charlotte to travel with her own small selection of reading material spread across the seat beside her, a hamper prepared by Mrs. Abbott's kitchen for the journey, and none of the careful social performance that would otherwise be required in closer quarters with unfamiliar company for several hours at a stretch. Their luggage travels separately, an entire small mountain of trunks and cases handled by porters at both ends of the journey, each item labelled and tracked with a precision that ensures nothing goes astray between Cheshire and Belgravia, a level of seamless, effortless transition between two full households that most travellers of this era, packing everything they own into a single worn case and managing every step of its journey themselves, could scarcely imagine. There is a particular luxury, too, simply in privacy itself, a concept that shapes nearly everything I have described to you tonight, without ever being named directly as its own category. Every member of this family sleeps alone, in their own room, behind their own closed door, a basic expectation so thoroughly built into their world that none of them has ever consciously registered it as remarkable. In most English households, even comfortable ones, siblings share rooms well into adulthood. Children sleep near parents out of simple necessity of space, and the particular solitude Charlotte enjoys each night, an entire room devoted purely to her own use, her own thoughts, her own version of rest, represents its own quiet, largely invisible form of considerable wealth. Beatrice, in her smaller household now, has kept this particular standard even where she has let others loosen, insisting on her own room separate from Arthur's, a fairly common arrangement among couples of their class, though one that would strike most working households as an almost unimaginable extravagance, an entire additional room simply for the privilege of occasionally sleeping alone. There is one final small luxury I want to mention before we begin easing toward the close of tonight's story, and it concerns something as simple as bathing itself. Ashcombe Hall was fitted, some 6 years ago now, with an actual fixed bathroom on the first floor, a genuine luxury even among houses of considerable wealth, containing a deep copper tub connected directly to the same piped hot water system that serves Charlotte's washstand, meaning that a proper hot bath, filled without a single servant carrying a single can up any staircase, has become, for this family, simply an ordinary evening possibility rather than the elaborate, labour-intensive undertaking it remains for almost everyone else in England. Most households across the country still bathe, when they bathe at all beyond basic daily washing, in a portable tin tub set before the kitchen fire, water heated separately and carried in bucket by bucket, the whole family sometimes sharing the same water in careful sequence from cleanest to least clean, an arrangement so universal that nobody outside a house like Ashcombe Hall would think to describe it as any particular hardship at all. It is simply how bathing works, the way water simply comes cold from a pump rather than warm from a tap, for nearly everyone who is not extremely fortunate. Charlotte's own evening bath, prepared by Agnes with a bar of milled soap scented faintly with the same rose that runs through her commissioned perfume, has become one of the quiet, genuine pleasures of her day, a private half-hour behind a locked door that belongs entirely to herself, no obligations, no careful social calculation, simply warm water and the particular, uncomplicated comfort of her own solitary thoughts. I think there is something worth noticing in how many of the luxuries I have described to you tonight, when you really look closely at them, turn out to be luxuries of privacy and solitude, nearly as much as luxuries of expense, small pockets of genuinely uninterrupted time that this family's wealth has purchased for them, again and again, in 100 different rooms across this one large, quiet house. I think, if I am honest with you, that what I actually find myself circling back to, having spent this long inside the Ashworth's world with you tonight, is not any single luxury on its own, not the ice house or the diamonds or the silk gowns or the piped hot water, but the sheer accumulated weight of all of it together, layer upon layer upon layer of careful, invisible effort poured continuously into making one particular family's ordinary life feel, to them, entirely effortless. Consider it for a moment, the way we have tonight, slowly, room by room, a housemaid rising before dawn so that Charlotte might wake to a room already warm, a gardener coaxing a pineapple to fruit through an English winter so that a dessert course might produce a small murmur of admiration, a perfumer in London holding a formula on file under one woman's name alone so that her particular scent might linger briefly in a room after she has already left it. None of these things on their own would strike anyone as extraordinary. It is only in the accumulation, the sheer relentless layering of small, careful comforts across every single hour of every single day, that you begin to see the true shape of what this family's wealth actually purchased for them. Not any one object, but an entire climate of ease that surrounded them so completely they rarely had to think about its existence at all. And I do not think that observation needs to curdle into anything harsh or judgmental. Not on a night like tonight. Not in a story meant to send you gently off to sleep rather than stir you up about questions of fairness and inheritance that neither of us can resolve at this hour anyway. I simply think it is worth noticing clearly once before we let this particular family rest for the night. Worth noticing the housemaid as much as the mistress. Worth noticing the years Mr. Sutcliffe spent counting silver he would never own. Worth noticing Agnes falling asleep most nights with a book still open on her chest in a small room at the top of a very large house that was never in any legal sense going to belong to her. Let me bring you back one final time to Charlotte on an ordinary autumn evening now some months after Beatrice's wedding, sitting alone in her small private sitting room while Henry finishes some final piece of correspondence in his study down the hall. The fire here burns low and steady, tended an hour ago and not yet needing further attention, and Charlotte has her needlework in her lap, the christening gown still slowly taking shape beneath her careful unhurried stitches, though there is as yet no actual grandchild to wear it, only a quiet, private hope she tends to almost as carefully as the embroidery itself. She thinks, in this particular unhurried hour, of a great many small things at once, the way your own mind probably drifts, this late, between one half-formed thought and the next. She thinks of Beatrice, settled now into her own smaller, happier version of this same careful world, still writing faithfully every week, still arguing occasionally with Arthur over hall tables and other small domestic nothings that Charlotte finds herself smiling about every time they come up in a letter. She thinks of Frederick, growing steadily into whatever particular shape of man he is eventually going to become, carrying, whether he fully knows it yet or not, some blend of his father's careful stewardship and something else entirely his own. There is a thought of her own mother too, gone now for several years, who kept a modest draper's shop in a modest northern town, and never once in her entire life sat in a room anything like this one. The small worn prayer book sits, as it always does, in the bottom drawer of the writing desk just a few feet away, and Charlotte does not need to take it out tonight to feel its presence there, a small private anchor connecting this warm, thoroughly cushioned life to something plainer and in its own way no less loved. Outside, past the tall windows, the last of the day's light has finally gone entirely, and somewhere below, in a kitchen gone quiet for the evening, a scullery maid's cat has already claimed its usual warm spot near the banked range. Somewhere above, in a small room at the top of the house, Agnes has fallen asleep again with her book still open. Somewhere out past the kitchen gardens, 6 carriage horses shift and settle in their stalls, and a half-buried mound of earth holds, sealed and silent, whatever remains of last winter's frozen lake, slowly, patiently waiting out the year until it is needed again. I keep thinking, writing this particular story, about how strange it is that we know as much as we do about a house like Ashcombe Hall, and so comparatively little about the cottages Charlotte visited on her fortnightly rounds, about Sarah Tench's own kitchen, her own fire, her own particular version of an ordinary evening. Wealth, it turns out, is not only a matter of comfort in its own moment, it is also quite literally a matter of what survives, which letters get kept in a family archive for 150 years, which ledgers get preserved, which lives get remembered in enough specific granular detail that someone like me can sit down all this time later and tell you what perfume a woman wore, what pattern her christening gown followed, what her lady's maid whispered to her once about marriage on a warm summer evening that neither of them ever mentioned again. Most lives, across most of human history, simply do not leave that kind of trace behind them. They pass, fully lived, fully felt, and then the particular texture of them dissolves, gradually, into the larger blur of history that only occasionally, almost by accident, preserves enough detail for someone to reconstruct a single evening this clearly. I think that is worth sitting with too, on a night like tonight, this quiet, humbling reminder that the story I have been telling you for the last several hours survives largely because of the very same wealth and privilege it describes. The fine paper, the careful archives, the family solicitors who kept every settlement and every letter filed away in exactly the kind of orderly permanence that only money can really guarantee. And yet there is still something worth loving in this story regardless, something worth returning to, worth imagining carefully and gently on a quiet night when sleep feels a little further away than you would like it to be. Not because this particular family's comfort was somehow more important or more real than anyone else's hardship, simply because it is a way in, a door left slightly open into a vanished world, and sometimes, late at night, a door left open is exactly the invitation we need to finally, gently, let our own thoughts go quiet. Let me take you, just for a moment, somewhere else entirely tonight, because I think it will help close this particular circle properly. Some 60 miles south, in a school dormitory that could not feel more different from Ashcombe Hall's careful, cushioned comfort, Frederick lies in a narrow iron bed, identical to a dozen others, lined up along the same plain wooden floor, a single thin blanket pulled up over his shoulders, considerably less luxurious than anything he has ever known at home, and yet he sleeps here just as soundly, just as completely as he ever has beneath his own family's careful watch. There is something worth noticing in that too, I think. However much wealth can purchase in the way of ease and comfort, sleep itself remains, stubbornly, one of the few things it cannot actually improve upon past a certain basic point. Frederick's plain iron bed and Charlotte's carefully warmed one deliver, in the end, roughly the same nightly gift: unconsciousness, rest, a body allowed to simply stop for a few hours and let the mind go quiet. Further south still, in the small, comfortable house near London that Beatrice now shares with Arthur, she sleeps curled slightly toward her husband's side of the bed, one hand resting near enough to his that it would take almost nothing at all for either of them to reach the other in the night. Her own smaller staff has banked her own smaller fire, and there is, in the particular careful architecture of her new life, a clear echo of everything she was raised inside at Ashcombe Hall, softened here, adjusted there, but recognisably, unmistakably, her mother's daughter all the same. And back in Cheshire, in the house where we began this whole long evening together, Charlotte has finally set her needlework aside for the night, has finally closed the drawer on her mother's small worn prayer book, has finally quietly joined Henry in the deep, unhurried sleep that this entire enormous, carefully engineered household exists, in its own particular way, purely to protect and preserve for the two of them, night after night after night. I have told you a great deal tonight, more perhaps than I originally intended when I first sat down to think through this particular family's world, and I find myself, even now, still turning over small details I did not manage to fit anywhere else. The particular sound a coal scuttle makes when it is not muffled properly, the exact shade of blue Beatrice chose over the safer ivory, the way Mr. Sutcliffe's face softened, just once a year, stirring a Christmas pudding he would never actually eat a full portion of himself. That is, I think, how a house like this one actually works, when you get close enough to it, not as one single grand story, but as hundreds of small overlapping ones, a housemaid's aching feet and a mistress's rosewater bath happening in the very same building, at the very same hour, each one entirely invisible to the other, and yet both of them in their own way, part of the same larger complicated whole. I do not think there is any tidy conclusion to draw from that, and I am not sure I want to draw one tonight anyway. Some things are simply true, layered, complicated, worth sitting with rather than resolving. What I do want to leave you with, as the fire in this particular story finally burns down toward its own quiet ending, is something considerably simpler. A house, however grand, however carefully engineered toward comfort and silence and invisible effort, is still, underneath everything, just a place where people slept and worried and loved each other and occasionally argued about hall tables and eventually, always, closed their eyes at the end of a long day and let go. You are doing that too, right now, I think, or close to it, wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of room surrounds you, whatever kind of day led you here. There is nothing standing between you and rest except your own willingness to let it finally arrive. No fittings to endure, no calling cards to decode, no dance card to fill. Just this, the plain, universally available luxury of closing your eyes and letting the rest of the night take care of itself. Let me tell you one more story before we finish, an older one, from nearly 20 years before any of tonight's events, because I think it explains rather a lot about the particular warmth that still runs quietly beneath this entire family, underneath all the silk and silver and carefully calibrated social manoeuvring we have spent so long examining together. Charlotte was 19 when she first met Henry, at an assembly room dance in the northern town where her mother kept her modest draper's shop, an occasion considerably less grand than anything Beatrice's own season would eventually produce, though it felt to Charlotte at the time like the most important evening of her entire life. Henry, 23 then, newly responsible for a growing portion of his father's mill business, attended that particular dance somewhat reluctantly, dragged along by a friend, with no particular expectation of the evening amounting to anything memorable at all. He noticed Charlotte, by his own later account, not because she was the most fashionably dressed woman in the room. She decidedly was not, her gown considerably plainer than most around her, but because she was laughing, genuinely and unself-consciously, at something her own sister had just said, a laugh Henry found himself, to his own mild surprise, unable to stop thinking about for the rest of that evening and, as it turned out, for a considerable while afterward. Their courtship that followed was not, by the standards of Charlotte's own eventual world, especially elaborate. There were no formal settlements negotiated for months, no careful trousseau assembled with quite the ceremony Beatrice's would later receive. Henry's own father, still very much alive and considerably more focused on the mills than on questions of social polish, raised only mild objections to his son's interest in a shopkeeper's daughter, objections that softened considerably once it became clear how genuinely, unshakably fond of her his son had become. They married within the year, in a ceremony far smaller and far plainer than Beatrice's own would eventually be, and Charlotte remembers, even now, nearly 2 decades later, the particular nervous, hopeful feeling of that first year of marriage, learning an entirely new set of rules, an entirely new way of speaking and dressing and moving through rooms, while Henry, for his part, learned things too, patience mostly, and a particular gentleness in correcting her occasional missteps that she has never forgotten and has tried, across all the years since, to extend just as generously toward her own children whenever they have needed it. I think that is worth knowing at the very end of tonight's long story. Beneath every diamond and every carefully engineered silence, beneath the green baize door and the pineapple glasshouse and the fan with its quiet, painful history, there is still, at the very center of this particular family, simply 2 people who fell in love at an ordinary dance in an ordinary northern town, and built, slowly, deliberately, across nearly 2 decades, an entire elaborate world together, one careful choice at a time. There is one more occasion I want to walk you through before we let this house finally rest. An autumn house party held at Ashcombe Hall itself the year following Beatrice's wedding, when a dozen guests come to stay for 4 full days, and the sheer logistics required to host that many people comfortably reveal, once more, just how much invisible machinery keeps a world like this one running smoothly. Each guest arrives with their own lady's maid or valet, meaning the servants' quarters swell considerably beyond their usual population for the duration of the visit, temporary arrangements worked out by Mrs. Crane with the same careful precision she brings to everything else, extra beds found, extra place settings assigned, an entire shadow household of visiting staff folded seamlessly into Ashcombe Hall's existing rhythms for 4 days before disappearing again as smoothly as they arrived. Menus for 4 full days of breakfasts, luncheons, teas and formal dinners are planned weeks in advance by Charlotte and Mrs. Abbott together, accounting for at least one guest's particular dislike of shellfish and another's doctor-recommended avoidance of anything overly rich. The gentlemen spend their mornings out with the estate's gamekeeper, walking the fields and woodland at the edges of the property, while the ladies remaining behind occupy themselves with the conservatory, with letters, with gentle walks through gardens that Charlotte has, this particular week, arranged to look their absolute best, every fallen leaf swept, every late-blooming flower coaxed into its final display before winter fully arrives. Evenings bring cards, and music, and the particular easy, extended intimacy that develops among a group of people confined pleasantly together for several days running, friendships deepening, alliances quietly forming, at least one promising conversation between a visiting young widow and a bachelor cousin of Louisa's that Charlotte watches with the same quiet, practiced attention she once brought to Beatrice's own budding courtship. By the time the last carriage departs on the fourth morning, the house feels, for a day or two afterward, strangely large and quiet again, and Charlotte finds herself walking through rooms so recently full of voices and now returned to their usual settled calm, appreciating freshly the particular pleasure of an ordinary evening with just herself and Henry for company once more. I want to spend just a little more time with Agnes before we finish tonight, because I think she deserves it, having stood so quietly at the edges of nearly every scene we have walked through together this evening. She is 28 now, unmarried still, though not, I think, entirely resigned to remaining so forever, and there is a particular ambition tucked quietly beneath her steady, capable exterior that Charlotte has only ever glimpsed in fragments, a hope, mentioned once and never repeated, of perhaps one day becoming a housekeeper herself in some smaller establishment, taking the considerable knowledge she has accumulated across nearly a decade of service, and finally putting it toward running a household of her own management, rather than simply attending someone else's. She has saved carefully, methodically, a portion of her wages each quarter for years now, kept in a small tin box beneath a loose floorboard in her room, a sum that would strike Charlotte, if she ever knew its exact figure, as impressively substantial for a woman in Agnes's position, though it remains, set against the scale of everything we have discussed tonight, the fan and the diamonds and the trousseau and the marriage settlement, a genuinely modest amount, painstakingly assembled one careful shilling at a time. There is no dramatic resolution to Agnes's particular story tonight, no wedding, no sudden inheritance, no tidy conclusion I can offer you. She simply continues, evening after evening, falling asleep with her book open on her chest, rising before the household stirs, tending to Charlotte's rosewater and her monogrammed linens and her small worn prayer book with the same quiet, careful competence she has brought to all of it for years now. I think there is something worth honouring in that particular steadiness, a life lived mostly in service to someone else's comfort, and yet still, underneath it, entirely her own, full of small private hopes that belong to nobody but her, tucked away as carefully as that tin box beneath her floorboard, waiting, patiently, for whatever comes next. The seasons continue turning at Ashcombe Hall the way they always have, autumn folding into winter, folding into the particular busy, hopeful rush of another spring season approaching, and there is a comfort, I think, in that steady, unhurried repetition. The ice house filled again each winter, the conservatory's orange trees fruiting again each summer, the household accounts balanced again each month by Charlotte and Mrs. Crane in that same small study off the main hallway, year after year, decade after decade, the specific details shifting gently while the underlying rhythm remains, largely unchanged. Beatrice writes that winter to say she is expecting her first child, news that sends Charlotte immediately to her writing desk, composing a reply so full of practical advice and genuine joy that she fills nearly 6 full pages before she even realizes how long she has been writing. The small embroidered christening gown, worked so carefully across so many quiet Sunday afternoons, will finally have its intended purpose after all, and there is a particular satisfaction in that, watching a piece of careful, patient handwork finally arrive at the moment it was always meant for. Frederick, meanwhile, continues his own slow, steady progress toward whatever future is waiting for him. University still some years off, though the shape of the man he is becoming grows clearer with each visit home, taller, quieter in some ways, louder in others, carrying forward, whether he knows it yet or not, some careful blend of his father's steady competence and something else entirely his own that neither Charlotte nor Henry can fully name yet, though both of them, watching him, suspect it will turn out to be something rather good. Ashcombe Hall itself will stand, largely unchanged in its outward appearance, for a great many more years beyond the particular evening we have spent inside it together tonight, weathering further weddings and further Christmases and further ordinary Tuesday afternoons that nobody at the time will think to record with any particular care, simply because they will feel, to everyone living through them, like nothing more than another unremarkable day inside an already familiar, already beloved house. Let me bring you back, one last time, to where we began this whole long evening, that green baize door on the ground floor of Ashcombe Hall, separating one careful world from another. It still hangs there, still muffling whatever sound passes through it, still doing the same quiet, invisible work it was doing on that autumn morning we first stepped inside this house together, hours ago now by your own clock, though only a single ordinary day within the story itself. I think what strikes me most, turning that image over one final time, is how completely that door has come to represent everything we have talked about tonight, not simply as a barrier between servants and family, but as a kind of physical embodiment of every careful, invisible effort that made this family's particular version of comfort possible at all. Every luxury we have walked through together, the ice, the silk, the diamonds, the piped hot water, the pineapple grown against every natural inclination of an English climate, all of it required someone, somewhere, doing careful, patient, largely unacknowledged work on the other side of some equivalent door, so that the family on this side might simply experience the result without ever quite having to see how it arrived. That is not, I think, a uniquely Victorian arrangement if you look at it honestly. Most comfort, in most eras, including whatever particular comfort surrounds you tonight as you listen to this, rests on some version of that same invisible labour, some equivalent door most of us rarely think to open. I offer that thought to you gently, not as any kind of guilt to carry into sleep with you, but simply as a small, quiet observation worth sitting with for a moment before we finally let this particular story close. The fan Charlotte's mother-in-law gave her still sits in its velvet-lined box, taken out perhaps twice a year even now. The small worn prayer book still lives in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, its cover a little softer at the corners with each passing year. Some objects, it turns out, simply stay, patient and quiet, carrying whatever private history we choose to fold into them, waiting for the particular late hours when we finally need them again. Let me take you to London for a while now, to the rented townhouse in Belgravia where the family spends each spring during the season, because I have mentioned this house in passing tonight without ever really taking you inside it, and it deserves its own attention, being in its way a rather different kind of luxury than anything Ashcombe Hall itself offers. This townhouse is tall and narrow, 5 full floors including the basement kitchens, wedged into a terrace of nearly identical white stucco-fronted houses that line the fashionable square where the family takes their lease each year, a considerably more vertical, compressed sort of grandeur than the sprawling comfort of Cheshire, every room reached by a steep, elegant staircase that Charlotte, by the end of a long season, has climbed and descended more times than she could possibly count. The family brings only a portion of their usual staff down from Ashcombe Hall for these months, Agnes and Mr. Sutcliffe among them, supplementing the household with additional London staff hired specifically for the season, including, this particular year, a French chef engaged on a temporary basis purely because a fashionable hostess entertaining during the season is expected to offer her guests something rather more sophisticated than what even Mrs. Abbott's considerable skill can produce, however unfair Charlotte privately considers that particular expectation to be toward a cook who has served the family faithfully for over a decade. It comes already furnished by its owner, an elderly widow who spends her own winters somewhere warmer and rents the property out each spring purely to cover its considerable annual upkeep. And there is something faintly strange, Charlotte has always thought, about living for 3 full months each year, surrounded by another woman's chosen furniture, another woman's paintings, another woman's particular taste imposed silently over every room the family occupies, a kind of temporary borrowed identity that never quite feels fully theirs no matter how many seasons they return to it. Fashion itself, During these London months, moves at a pace Cheshire simply cannot match, and Charlotte finds herself each spring ordering at least 2 or 3 gowns directly from a fashion house in Paris, communicated through a considerable exchange of letters and fabric samples with a dressmaker who has never once met her in person, trusting entirely in written measurements and a portrait photograph sent the previous year to produce garments that will, remarkably, fit her almost perfectly when they finally arrive by careful, insured shipment some 6 weeks later. The season also brings its own particular category of evening entertainment that Ashcombe Hall, for all its comforts, simply cannot offer, and chief among these is the opera, attended most weeks throughout the season from a private box that Henry maintains on a subscription basis at one of London's principal houses, a considerable annual expense that buys the family not merely a good seat, but a small semi-private room of their own overlooking the stage, furnished with its own chairs and a small anteroom where refreshments can be taken privately during intervals, rather than jostling for space among the general crowd below. Being seen in this box matters nearly as much among Charlotte's circle as whatever happens to be performing on the stage that particular evening. Opera glasses turned as often toward the neighbouring boxes as toward the actual performers, a whole silent second drama of observation and evaluation playing out continuously above the orchestra pit throughout every single performance. Charlotte has grown genuinely fond of the music itself over the years, beyond its social function, and there is a particular evening this season, a performance she finds herself unexpectedly moved by, when she catches herself wiping away a tear during a particularly affecting aria and glances instinctively toward the neighbouring boxes to see whether anyone noticed, an instinct so automatic by now that she barely registers doing it at all. Beatrice, attending several performances this season with her own new husband rather than her parents, finds herself experiencing London society now from an entirely different angle, no longer the young unmarried woman being carefully evaluated, but a married woman in her own right, entitled to a slightly different, slightly more relaxed set of social rules that she is still, several months into her marriage, gradually learning to manage. There is a particular satisfaction, she confides to her mother over tea one afternoon, in no longer needing a chaperone's careful supervision every time she wishes to simply walk across a crowded room to speak with a friend. Charlotte listens to this observation with a private, complicated mixture of pride and something close to wistfulness, remembering her own version of that same particular freedom arriving all those years ago and finding it, even now, worth remembering clearly. There is a final London ritual I want to describe before we head back to Cheshire for good tonight, and it concerns something that sounds almost trivial on its surface but carries, underneath it, the same careful social calculation that governs almost everything else in this world. Each afternoon during the season, fashionable society gathers along a particular stretch of park pathway to simply walk, or ride, or be driven slowly past one another in open carriages, seeing and being seen in a ritual so precisely timed that everyone who matters understands, without ever being told directly exactly which hour they are expected to appear. Charlotte's own carriage joins this slow procession several times a week, drawn by the same beautifully matched pair Dobbs has spent years assembling, and there is a particular skill involved in managing this hour correctly, acknowledging acquaintances with exactly the right degree of warmth, neither too effusive nor too cool, timing one's own appearance to coincide, ideally, with whichever other families one most wishes to be seen alongside. Mrs. Pemberton, in her first season fully accepted into this circle, confesses to Charlotte one afternoon that she found the whole ritual bewildering at first, an entire hour of apparently aimless movement that turned out, on closer inspection, to be governed by rules as intricate as anything in a formal dance. Beatrice, riding alongside her mother in the open carriage one particularly fine afternoon, points out with the specific dry humour she has grown into since her marriage that the whole procession rather resembles a flock of birds, everyone moving in careful coordinated patterns that look, from a distance, like nothing more than pleasant chaos, but that reveal, up close, an entire hidden structure nobody involved would ever think to question. Charlotte laughs at the comparison, genuinely, and finds herself, for the rest of that particular ride, watching the surrounding carriages with fresh eyes, seeing, as if for the first time in years, exactly how strange and how carefully engineered this whole familiar ritual actually is. It is, I think, one of the small pleasures of watching your own children grow into adulthood, this occasional gift of seeing your entirely ordinary world reflected back at you through fresh, slightly irreverent eyes, reminding you that even the most deeply familiar rituals were, once, strange enough to comment on. By the time the season finally closes each July and the family packs up the Belgravia house for another year, everyone is, in their own quiet way, glad to return to Cheshire, to Ashcombe Hall's slower, more spacious rhythms after months of London's dense, carefully choreographed social calendar. The journey home feels different from the journey down each spring, lighter somehow, though the luggage carried is, if anything, considerably heavier. Several new gowns added to Charlotte's already substantial wardrobe, a scattering of small gifts purchased for Mrs. Abbott and Mrs. Crane and the rest of the staff who remained behind managing the house through their absence. There is a particular pleasure, arriving back at Ashcombe Hall after months away, in walking through rooms that belong, unmistakably, entirely to the family itself, rather than some elderly widow's temporary taste. Charlotte's own chosen furniture, her own paintings, her own careful arrangements exactly as she left them, tended faithfully in her absence by a staff who take genuine, quiet pride in having kept everything running smoothly without her direct oversight for so many weeks. Mrs. Crane greets her on the front steps with the household ledger already prepared for review, and there is something comforting, Charlotte finds, in immediately settling back into that familiar small study off the main hallway, going through accounts that have accumulated across her absence, the flowers, the coal, the ice, all of it exactly as expected, the whole careful machinery of this particular life having continued turning smoothly without her, ready now to simply fold her back into its rhythms as though she had never left at all. The conservatory's orange trees have grown considerably fuller across the months away, and Charlotte spends a good portion of her first afternoon home simply sitting there, in the same wicker chair Beatrice once favoured, breathing in air that smells, after months of London's coal smoke and crowded streets, remarkably clean and green, and entirely her own. It is, she thinks, settling into that particular quiet, one of the truest luxuries this whole elaborate life has ever offered her. Not the gowns or the diamonds or the private opera box, but simply this, the ability to leave an entire world behind for months and return to find another one, equally beloved, waiting patiently, exactly as she left it. I want to mention one final household ritual before we return, finally and completely, to the quiet close of this story, and it is a small one, easy to overlook, though I think it captures something true about how this entire elaborate world actually sustains itself year after year. Each August, once the season's exhausting social calendar has fully released its grip, and before the autumn round of dinner parties and house parties begins again, there is a brief, deliberate lull at Ashcombe Hall, a handful of weeks where almost nothing formal is scheduled at all, no guests expected, no fittings required, simply the family and the estate settling into a slower, more private version of themselves. Henry uses these weeks to walk his own land properly, something he rarely finds time for during the busier months, accompanied sometimes by Frederick when he is home, the two of them covering the same fields and boundaries that Henry's father once walked, checking fences, discussing tenants, attending to the practical, unglamorous business that actually underlies the whole comfortable structure everyone else in the family simply enjoys the benefits of. Charlotte spends these weeks in the garden more than any other time of year, working alongside the head gardener on plans for the following spring, a hobby she has never fully admitted to anyone as genuinely important to her, though anyone watching her kneel in the soil, hands bare, sleeves pushed carelessly up past her elbows in a way she would never permit herself during the season, would understand immediately how much she treasures this particular quiet freedom. It is in its way the plainest stretch of the entire year, and also, Charlotte has come to feel, one of the richest, this brief pause where the whole family simply exists together without any particular performance required of them, without any careful calculation of precedence or presentation, just an ordinary house in an ordinary English August, the fires unlit for now, the windows thrown open to whatever warm breeze happens to drift across the lawn, everyone finally, briefly, exactly where they want to be. And it is here, I think, in this particular quiet stretch of late summer, that the true shape of this family's happiness reveals itself most clearly, not in the diamonds or the opera box or the carefully engineered silence of a well-run house, but in this, simply this, an ordinary afternoon, everyone home, everyone well, everyone, for a little while longer, safe within the same familiar walls. There is one last object I want to mention, small and easy to miss, sitting on the mantelpiece in Charlotte's own sitting room, a plain wooden box, considerably plainer than almost anything else on display in this house, holding a modest collection of pressed flowers gathered over the years, one from each significant occasion the family has marked together. A sprig from Beatrice's wedding bouquet, a small white bloom from the christening gown's very first fitting, a leaf Frederick once brought her proudly from his first morning at the home farm, the year he still found the ice house thrilling and the calf's birth worth an entire breathless account at dinner. Nobody else in the household quite understands the significance of this particular box, and Charlotte has never explained it fully to anyone, not even Henry, who assumes, when he thinks of it at all, that it is simply one of his wife's small, sentimental habits, harmless and slightly mysterious the way certain small habits within any long marriage remain, affectionately unexamined, for years at a stretch. She adds to it perhaps twice a year now, some quiet evening finding her kneeling briefly beside the mantelpiece, pressing a new fragment of some recent memory between the pages of an old ledger, kept specifically for that purpose, before returning the box to its place and moving on with whatever the rest of the evening holds. I think that box, more than the diamonds, more than the fan, more even than the small worn prayer book in her writing desk, represents the truest thing this entire story has been trying to tell you all along. That underneath every careful, elaborate luxury we have walked through together tonight, underneath the silk and the silver and the pineapple grown against all sense in an English winter, there remains, quietly, stubbornly, something considerably simpler and considerably more universal, a woman keeping small, private evidence of the people she loves, pressed carefully between pages, kept safe against whatever time eventually does to everything else. So let me leave you there, in that particular quiet hour, the whole house finally settled, the whole long day finally folded away behind it. Somewhere in Cheshire, frost is beginning to gather again on the lawn outside Ashcombe Hall's tall windows, the same particular cold that greeted us at the very start of this story, though a full turn of the seasons has passed now between that first frosty morning and this one. The fires have all been banked, the silver has been counted and returned to its locked room. The ice house holds whatever remains of last winter's careful harvest, waiting, as it always waits, for the summer that will eventually come to slowly claim it. Charlotte sleeps. Henry sleeps beside her, one hand still resting near enough to hers to find without searching. Somewhere south, Frederick sleeps in his narrow school bed, and somewhere further south still, Beatrice sleeps curled toward her husband, one hand resting protectively, now, over the small quiet beginning of the child she is carrying. Somewhere above the family's own rooms, Agnes sleeps with her book fallen shut at last, her small tin box of careful savings still safely hidden beneath its loose floorboard. Somewhere past the kitchen gardens, 6 horses breathe slow and steady in the dark, and a gardener's careful pineapple plants sit patient and warm beneath their heated glass, entirely unaware of how far they are from wherever they actually began. This whole enormous, carefully extravagant world exists, in the end, for exactly this particular hush, this particular stillness, everyone finally where they belong, everyone finally, briefly, at rest. And I think that is not so very different, really, from what you are doing right now, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. You have your own version of a warm room, your own version of a settled house, your own particular quiet hour, arriving now, gently, the way it always eventually does. Let it arrive. Let your own eyes close the way Charlotte's have, the way Beatrice's have, the way this whole house, this whole richly furnished story has finally, softly come to rest. Sleep well, tonight, whoever you are, wherever you are. This particular door at last is closing gently behind us,